Hey guys, tonight you're going back to a time before clocks and calendars told people what to do, back to the edge of a long northern coastline where the sky stayed grey for days and the cold came creeping early. Tonight's story is about how warmth was built in places without insulation and how people who didn't always speak kindly to each other still leaned in closer when the wind howled. You're not going to be a warrior or a raider, not a chieftain or a skald. You're just one person, tucked inside a long timber hall, with the smoke curling up into the rafters and a wooden bowl warming your lap. You're living a winter in the Viking Age, and this is the season that will shape the bonds around you, like frost shaping the edge of a window. So settle in. Let your thoughts drift where the snow hasn't fallen yet, but will soon. The wind is quiet for now, and the fire is crackling low. You've got time before sleep, and time before the storm. The sky outside your longhouse was the colour of wet wool, and though no snow had fallen yet, you could feel it coming. The air had that sharp, dry quality that made your nose sting and your breath rise in tight little clouds that vanished before they touched the sky. You were sitting on the edge of the split-log bench near the door, working a length of twine through the handle of a basket that needed repair. Your fingers ached from the cold, and you kept blowing on them, which only helped for a few seconds before the chill crept back in. The village sat quiet today. Most of the men had taken to the woods that morning to bring down more timber. You could hear the occasional thud of an axe echoing faintly through the fjord, like a heart beating far away under snow. Inside, the longhouse was already half filled with motion. Your mother and aunt were hunched over the central hearth, stirring the morning porridge with slow, practiced hands. The fire popped as resin in the pine logs spat now and then, and the smell of smoke clung to everything, your clothes, your hair, even the rough wool of your mitts. This year had been harder than the last. A fishing boat was lost in August, and with it your uncle's livelihood. The sea had taken the boat and almost taken him too. He had come back soaked, coughing seawater, shaking as if the cold had tried to pull him apart. No one spoke about it much, but the longhouse had been tighter ever since. Now it was your household and theirs, all together under one sloping roof, sharing firewood, sharing barley, sharing sleep space. The youngest cousin still cried some nights when the wind got too loud. Your father had tried to wall off a corner with spare timber to give her a sense of her own place, but it was more for show than shelter. When the cold came through the cracks in the planks, it didn't much care whose side of the house it was. You returned inside after finishing the basket work, pushing the heavy fur pelt aside from the doorway. The warmth hit your face with a sleepy relief, not hot, but enough to soften your jaw and chase the ache from your knees. Your father had already gone out again with the other men. Your sister sat on a low stool grinding oats with the back of a stone, humming something under her breath that you didn't recognize. You nodded to her, and she didn't look up, but you saw the corner of her mouth lift slightly. She was always that way, quiet, even when she was glad to see you. You found your place near the fire, the same flat stone, beside the iron pot you sat on each morning. The bench creaked under you as you leaned back against the wall, letting the heat from the embers work its way through your cloak and into your spine. You pulled your bowl closer and began to eat. Barley, salt, a little dried fish crumbled in. Nothing special, not even warm any more, but it filled the space where hunger had started. Across the hearth, your uncle sat sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes, the kind that made no noise, but you could still hear them if you paid attention. His eyes didn't rise, but you could tell he was listening to everything around him. The man hadn't spoken more than a few words at a time since the sea had taken his boat. His voice had gone quiet like a fire dying under snow. You respected him more now, in a way. He'd lost everything but never once asked for help. Just moved his family in, brought his strength to the woodpile and his quiet discipline to the work. You often wondered if grief like his froze over, or if it just sank deeper down like stones in cold water. Your cousin Frey was sitting next to him, carving a spindle with a look of pure focus. He was about your age, maybe a little older, and in summers past the two of you had fished together and laughed about the way the old men coughed after drinking their mead too fast. But since moving in, things had changed. Not in a bad way, just quieter. There was less space to joke and more to carry. Still, when your eyes met, there was something solid there. You nodded once and he returned it. That was enough. Words didn't always stretch far in winter. Sometimes nods were sturdier. The room grew darker, even as the day hadn't yet reached its peak. Outside, clouds were sliding in over the fjord, low and heavy. You knew it meant snow would come by nightfall, the kind of thick, wet snow that stuck to roofs and muffled every footstep until even the dogs walked without sound. You'd need to bring in more wood and double-check the meat hooks in the storage pit. The last thing anyone wanted was to find out the wolves had gotten into the dried fish because someone left the outer grate loose. Your mother passed behind you, laying out skins to mend by the far corner. Her face was drawn today. She hadn't slept well, and the fire had burned low before dawn. You'd heard her, up in the night, murmuring to your father about the barley stores. She thought you hadn't heard. You always heard. Everyone heard. But in winter, you didn't bring worry into the daylight, unless you had to. The light was short enough without adding more shadows. As the day stretched into late afternoon, and the fire had been fed twice, your aunt began baking flat cakes on the stone slab over the coals. The smell, sharp and yeasty, filled the space with something close to comfort. You found yourself watching the way the dough browned at the edges and thought about how something so simple, just flour and warmth, could change the whole mood of a house. When she handed you one, you didn't say anything. You just took it, broke it in half, and passed the other half to Frey without looking at him. He took it. Another nod. That was the closest thing to a smile you'd shared in weeks. By nightfall, the snow had come, just as you knew it would. It brushed soft against the roof like a slow drum beat. The dogs growled once and then settled, curling against each other near the hearth. You lay back on your pallet, wrapped in wool and fur, the scent of smoke in your nose, and the heat of 5 other bodies lying close nearby. Someone snored, someone coughed. Somewhere in the dark, the child cried softly and was hushed. And you, watching the flicker of embers in the hearth's final breath of life, felt something strange. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of rootedness, a feeling that you were not alone in this. That whatever came in the next days, you would bear it together. There was no room to stretch out, no silence to call your own, no riches to speak of. But there were feet near your feet, breathing beside your breathing, and the creak of a timber roof holding back the storm. Before we get started, if you're enjoying this space we share, go ahead and tap like and subscribe. It really helps keep these little stories going. And hey, drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this quiet corner of the internet reaches, all right? Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soft hum, and find a comfy spot to settle in. Let the world fade out for a bit. Tonight's story is just for you. The snow didn't stop that night. It kept falling long after the fire had burned low, and even the snoring had faded into the hush of deep sleep. By morning, the world outside was a blank white silence, the kind that made every sound seem too loud and every movement feel like a disruption. When you woke, it was still dark, the kind of darkness that didn't lift for hours. The air in the longhouse was heavy with wood smoke and breath, and your face was cold despite the warmth of bodies nearby. You turned slowly beneath your blanket, the wool scratchy against your cheek, and opened your eyes just enough to see the low orange flicker of the rekindled fire. Your mother was already awake, moving quietly, her shadow long and patient against the timbered wall. She was feeding small pieces of birch bark into the coals, coaxing them to life before adding kindling, and finally logs. Her hands moved with the tired grace of someone who did this every day without ever needing to think about it. You could smell the old resin in the wood beginning to catch, hear the faint pop of sap, and feel the slow spread of heat that chased the worst of the chill away from your toes. No one spoke in the early hours, that was the rule, though no one had ever said it out loud. Mornings in winter were sacred in their own quiet way. Everyone moved gently through them, as if afraid too much noise might shake something fragile loose from the ceiling. You sat up, pulling your blanket tighter around your shoulders, and watched your breath rise in soft wisps in the thin light. The roof beams above were strung with bundles of drying herbs, old nets waiting for repair, and sacks of last season's onions, their papery skins rustling faintly whenever the air stirred. Your sister was awake too, wrapping cloth around her feet in preparation for a trip outside. The latrine had to be cleared every morning, even in snow, and this task often fell to her or to you, depending on who moved first. Today, it was her. She caught your eye for a brief moment, said nothing, and moved to the door, pushing aside the thick fur covering with a grunt as the cold swept in like a slap. It was always shocking, that first breath of morning air, and you saw her recoil slightly before stepping into the snow. Then she was gone, the fur falling back into place, and the silence inside resumed. The others began to stir as the light outside grew pale and soft, seeping in through the small smoke holes high in the roof. Your uncle coughed harshly, a sound that had become part of the rhythm of the household, and sat up slowly from his place near the opposite wall. He reached for his boots, always placed neatly beside him, and rubbed his face with both hands before beginning the slow process of preparing for another day, with the kind of weariness that lives in the bones, not just the muscles. Frey was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. He often lay longer than the rest, not out of laziness, but because he didn't like to move too quickly in the morning. You could tell he was listening, though, the way his shoulders shifted slightly beneath his blanket whenever someone spoke or walked nearby. When you finally stood, stretching the stiffness from your back, he opened one eye just enough to acknowledge you, then closed it again without a word. Breakfast was the same as the day before and the day before that. Barley porridge, this time with a little crushed hazelnut added for flavor. It was your aunt's touch, something she did on days when she could feel the house's mood drooping. You were grateful for it, more than you could say. The flavor was small but bright in your mouth, a sharp reminder that comfort could still be made from what little was left. You ate slowly, savoring it, the warmth of the bowl cradled between your hands a comfort in its own right. Outside, the snow deepened. You could hear it as much as you saw it, the way it muffled everything. No birds, no voices, no wind strong enough to rustle the thatch. Just the occasional creak of the longhouse settling under its own weight and the distant rhythm of boots crunching through frost as one of the neighbors passed by. It was the kind of snow that made you feel small in the world. Not unimportant, but quieted, humbled. It reminded you that no matter how much wood you had stacked, or how many dried fish hung in the loft, the world could still stop everything with a single, long night and a stretch of clouds. Later that day, you helped your father and uncle dig a trench along the outer wall to keep the meltwater from creeping in when the thaw came. It was hard work, especially with the ground so stiff and the snow so heavy, but the kind of work that warmed you from the inside. No one talked much while you worked. It wasn't necessary. You all knew what needed to be done and how to do it. The silence wasn't cold, it was just practical. Occasionally your uncle would grunt, not in frustration but in rhythm, and your father would nod as he worked, his breath steaming from his beard. When the trench was finished and the snow shoveled away from the doorway, you returned inside with numb fingers and boots soaked through. Your mother handed you a cloth to dry, them, her hands, rough but gentle, as she pressed your palms together in hers for a moment. There wasn't much she could do about the cold, but that touch, that brief squeeze, held more care than a whole fire's worth of warmth. As the sky began to dim once again, the longhouse filled with the soft chatter of evening. Someone told a story, something about a bear that once wandered into the lower field and chased the goats into the stream. The children laughed at that, their voices ringing high and clear. Even Frey chuckled quietly, and for a moment the room felt lighter. Your father began carving a new spoon from a length of birch, his knife moving slowly, carefully, and the steady rasp of blade on wood was a soothing rhythm in the background. Your sister and aunt prepared the evening stew, peeling dried roots and soaking them in warm water to soften. You sat near the fire, not speaking, just listening. Listening to the sounds of home. The familiar ones, the creak of the bench when someone shifted, the scrape of bowls being stacked, the soft clatter of wooden tools, the fire's breath as it licked the sides of the iron pot. It wasn't grand, this life. It wasn't the stuff of sagas or songs, but it was steady. It was shared. And in the deep stillness of the second night of snow, you began to understand something you hadn't known before. That hardship didn't always announce itself with thunder or sorrow. Sometimes it just came slowly, like a frost creeping under the door. And family, the real kind, didn't push it back with shouting or grand speeches. They just stayed close, wrapped your feet when you didn't ask, passed you the last piece of bread without a word, sat beside you in silence when you didn't know what to say. As you curled again beneath your blanket that night, the snow still falling outside, you thought not of what was missing, but of what was still here, the fire, the voices, the small warmth of shared space. It would be a long winter, you knew that, but maybe, just maybe, not a lonely one. The snow that had come steadily for 2 days finally paused sometime in the night. When you stepped outside in the early morning, the air was so still, it felt like even the trees were holding their breath. The world had been transformed into something soft and white and quiet, so quiet that your footsteps on the packed snow made your ears ring. The sky above was pale and empty, not yet blue but no longer grey, and it gave everything a strange kind of glow that didn't feel like light exactly, but more like the ghost of sunlight waiting its turn. The roof of the longhouse was draped in a thick quilt of snow, and icicles hung from the thatch like teeth. You wrapped your cloak tighter around your chest and moved quickly to the woodpile, your breath streaming behind you like a banner. The axe handle was cold in your hand, but it was familiar. The grain of it smooth where your fingers had worn it down over the years, the balance of its weight already part of your body. There was something comforting about splitting wood in the silence of snow. Each strike felt like a heartbeat, steady and useful, and the sound of the crack echoed out into the emptiness as if answering a call you hadn't realized was waiting. You worked slowly, not because you were tired, but because you liked how the work settled you. One log at a time, you built a rhythm. The cold seeped into your bones, but the motion kept it at bay, and soon your cheeks were flushed and your shoulders warm. The smell of fresh pine filled your nose, sharp and bright against the dull scent of smoke that still clung to your clothes from the night before. When you finally paused, hands on your knees and breath heavy, you felt a quiet kind of pride. A stack of clean, split logs stood behind you, taller than your shoulder, ready to keep the hearth burning for another few days. It wasn't glorious, but it was good. Back inside, the sea, a longhouse was slowly waking. The fire had been stoked again, and you could hear the scrape of ladles and the murmur of low voices as the morning stew was stirred. The scent of onion and root vegetable was faint but welcome, and you felt your stomach grumble even though you'd eaten not long ago. You pulled off your cloak and hung it near the doorway, the ice at the hem already beginning to melt and leave small puddles on the packed dirt floor. Your mother was kneeling near the hearth, coaxing another log into place, and she looked up just enough to meet your eyes. She gave you a look that said what she always said when you returned from doing something useful. Nothing at all, but everything you needed. You gave her a nod, then stepped toward the basin to wash your hands, the water bitterly cold and clean. The cloth you used to dry them was stiff and rough, but it felt good to be clean. The day passed slowly, as winter days tend to do when there is little to do but keep the house standing and the food cooking. You spent part of the afternoon helping Frey repair a torn fishing net, your fingers moving carefully along the twine as he worked in silence beside you. Every now and then he would glance up to check your work, then return to his own, and you didn't need more than that. There had been a time, not so long ago, when you might have teased each other over a crooked knot or an uneven weave, but that kind of talk felt distant now, not gone, but folded away like summer tunics in a chest. What you had now was something quieter, something steadier. You sat with your shoulders nearly touching, the sound of the fire crackling behind you and the wind brushing against the roof above, and you worked until your hands ached and the net looked whole again. That evening, something shifted in the air, not the weather but the mood. After supper, your aunt began to sing. She did not have a loud voice nor a particularly beautiful one, but it was strong and sure and carried the tune like a river carries a boat. It was an old song, one you remembered from childhood, about a herder lost in the snow who found his way back home by following the sound of his mother's cooking pot. The children sat still, wide-eyed and silent, listening with a kind of reverence usually reserved for feast days or thunder. Even the adults grew quiet. Your father leaned back against the wall with his eyes half closed, and your mother's hands stilled in her sewing. The song didn't last long, but when it ended there was a moment of hush, so complete it almost felt like the room was holding its breath. Then someone laughed, soft and surprised, and the tension broke like thin ice underfoot. Your uncle, who had said so little in recent days, cleared his throat and offered another verse. It was rougher, less in tune, but full of memory. It was about chopping wood in a storm and finding a wolf pup sheltering in the hollow of a tree. Everyone chuckled at that, even the children, and for a while the room filled with small, overlapping voices. Stories rose and fell like waves. Each one passed like a torch to the next speaker. No one told anything grand or heroic, just memories. The time someone dropped a whole jar of honey into the well. The day Frey got his finger stuck in a fish jaw and refused to cry in front of the girls. The winter your father fell asleep outside and had to be carried in, covered in frost, like a walking snowman. And in the telling, something warm uncoiled itself inside you. Not laughter exactly, though there was plenty of that, but something deeper, a sense of being held by something larger than the cold, larger than the dark. When the sheaves were made, children were sent to bed and the embers began to dim. You lingered near the fire, the wool blanket around your shoulders and your legs tucked up beneath you. Frey sat opposite, twisting a length of cord through his fingers in a rhythm that matched the pulsing quiet of the room. Your uncle dozed upright, his head resting against a support beam, mouth slightly open, breath steady. Your aunt leaned against him, her eyes closed, her face soft in the firelight. For a long time, no one said anything, and that was fine. Words weren't always needed. You could hear the snow shifting outside, melting slightly at the edge of the roof, and the faint click of ice falling in slow, lazy drops. Somewhere near the doorway, the cat stirred and settled again. You thought of all the winters before this one, the winters when the longhouse had felt bigger because there were fewer people in it, the winters when you'd spent more time outside, when your body ached from fishing or hunting or climbing the frost-slick hills to check the traps. Those winters had felt different, like something to survive alone. But this winter, with its overcrowded benches and shared blankets, and silence thick enough to carry the weight of every breath, this one felt shared. Not just endured, but experienced together. That was something you hadn't expected to feel. You'd thought the closeness would make things harder, that too many voices in one room would rub raw at the edges of patience. And maybe sometimes it did, but mostly what it did was soften things. It reminded you that hardship was lighter when carried in more than one pair of hands. Eventually your mother stood and walked past you, her hand resting lightly on your shoulder as she passed. Just the weight of it, the brief warmth of her palm through the blanket, made your chest feel tight in a good way. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. You nodded, stood, and followed her to the sleeping area. The furs were cold at first, but you knew they'd warm quickly. They always did. You lay down beside your sister, who mumbled something half asleep and curled closer. The scent of her hair was familiar, like straw and wool and something sweet from the stew. The fire crackled one last time and settled into a whisper. The house exhaled. And you let sleep take you, not all at once, but gently, like a tide slipping in over the sand. The next morning brought a dim greyness that pressed against the smoke holes and seemed to stretch across the inside of your skull like a dull cloth. It was one of those days where light didn't so much arrive as seep into the room reluctantly, casting everything in a tired sort of hush. You woke not to sound, but to the stillness of breath and the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted nearby. The fire had burned low again in the night, and even under the furs the cold had curled around your feet like a damp dog. You pulled your cloak tighter as you sat up, bones cracking a little as they often did now when the cold had worked its way in. Across the room, your uncle was already awake and pulling on his outer tunic with the same slow, practiced movements you'd come to expect from him. He moved like someone who had once done things with confidence and now moved with patience instead. You pushed yourself up and stood for a moment near the hearth, letting the early coals paint a faint warmth across your shins. The room smelled of people and wood smoke and old bread. You picked up the fire iron and stirred the ash gently, careful not to wake the child still asleep nearby. The coals were glowing faintly, like the last memory of something once fierce, and you began feeding them pieces of bark and splinters shaved from last week's chopping. The wood caught slowly, grudgingly, but the smoke began to rise and you sat beside it, waiting as the heat crept back into the space like a cautious visitor. Your mother joined you, not long after. She didn't speak, only nodded as she passed, the lines under her eyes dark and soft from a night of broken sleep. She carried a small basket of dried mushrooms and oats and began sorting them near the hearth, laying each item out with care as if the act itself might coax more from the meager pile. You watched her hands move, the slight tremble in her knuckles from the cold or age, or simply the weight of too many days like this one. She noticed you watching and offered a small smile, tired but genuine, the kind that reminded you how long she had held this family together through years when even the earth seemed tired of feeding people. As the fire grew, so did the movement around the longhouse. One by one, your siblings and cousins began to stir. Frey emerged from his blanket cocoon with his usual groan and stretch, his hair stuck flat on one side, and his eyes still fogged with sleep. He gave you a look that said he wasn't ready for the day but would meet it anyway, which was about all that could be asked during these long months. The child coughed softly and curled deeper under the furs, and someone else, maybe your aunt, murmured a half-prayer toward the ceiling in thanks that the roof had held firm through another night. It wasn't a formal thing, just a habit, a quiet ritual to balance against the weight of another frozen morning. Breakfast was smaller than usual. The oats had to stretch, and there was only a smear of last season's honey left, barely enough to coat a spoon. Your mother distributed the bowls with a firm hand and a soft voice, reminding everyone without saying it outright that there wouldn't be more until the stew was ready later. No one complained. Hunger wasn't new, and it wasn't something to be wasted on words. You took your bowl and sat near Frey, who was carefully sipping his portion, as if drawing every drop into memory. You didn't speak, but your knees bumped once and neither of you moved away. That was enough. You shared heat and silence and the rhythm of breath. Later that day, while the others busied themselves with mending boots and repairing straps for sleds, you were sent, with your father and Frey, to check the storage pits near the tree line. It was a short walk, but hard going in the snow that had drifted up in strange, unpredictable ways, hiding rocks and roots that threatened to twist your ankle with every step. The cold was worse in the open. There, away from the walls and the fire, it reached into your lungs and made your chest ache with each breath. You trudged forward with your shoulders hunched and your hands deep in your sleeves, watching your father's broad back ahead of you, his footsteps pressing clean prints into the powdery white. When you reached the pits, you helped brush away the snow and ice from the lids, revealing the rough wooden covers that kept scavengers and wind from reaching the food below. Your father pried one open with his knife and peered inside, nodding once. The salted fish was holding, and the roots had only a little frost damage. Frey passed down a small bag to take a portion back for the next few days. You worked quickly, fingers aching from cold and effort, until the bag was filled. As you stood to tie it off, Frey stumbled a little on the icy edge and nearly fell. Without thinking, you reached out and grabbed his arm, steadying him. He looked at you for a moment, startled, and then laughed. It was a small sound, tight from the cold, but real. You found yourself smiling back, not wide, just enough. The moment passed without fanfare, and you walked back together in silence. The rest of the day passed in pieces. You helped grind the dried herbs into powder for the stew, while your sister prepared the broth. Your hands smelled like juniper and smoke. The rhythm of the mortar and pestle was soothing, and for a while it was easy to forget the hunger, sitting quietly at the edge of everyone's awareness. When the stew was ready, your aunt ladled it carefully into the communal bowls, making sure every portion was as equal as her eyes could measure. The room filled with the smell of boiled root and fish, and the hint of dried herbs, and for a little while the only sound was the soft scrape of spoons and the quiet sighs of eating. That night, before the fire burned too low, your father told a story. He hadn't told one in weeks, and everyone turned to listen. His voice was low and gravelly, more wind than thunder, and he spoke of a winter years ago when the snow had come early and lasted too long, and the only way they'd survived was by trading the last of their cheese to a wandering hunter who had a reindeer haunch and bad manners. The story wasn't funny exactly, but there were moments that made people chuckle, and the children leaned forward with wide eyes. Your father didn't exaggerate. He told it plain and slow, and when it was done, he leaned back and looked into the fire like it might offer a reply. Afterward, as the longhouse settled into its nightly hush, you sat with Frey and mended one of the old snowshoes. The leather had cracked and needed replacing. He worked the stitching while you held the frame, your fingers cold and stiff but sure. Every now and then, you'd hand him a strip of hide or pull a knot tight, and he would nod. At one point he looked up and said, softly, so the others wouldn't hear, that it was easier now, the sharing, the closeness, the noise. Not easier in a comfortable way, but easier in a way that didn't hurt anymore. You didn't answer right away, you didn't have to. You just kept holding the frame, and when he finished tying the final stitch, you met his eyes and gave him a small, tired smile. He returned it. That night, as sleep took hold and the fire ebbed into a faint, red glow, you lay beneath your blankets and listened to the soft chorus of breath rising around you, each one different, each one familiar. You counted them, not out of worry, but out of something quieter. A kind of gratitude, maybe, for the way the snow had brought you all under one roof, for the way hardship hadn't crushed you, but folded you together like layers of wool, for the way, even in the darkest months, something warm could still grow. It was a brittle morning, the kind that arrived not with snow or storms, but with a thin wind that found its way through every seam in your clothing, slipping under cloaks and into boots, needling the skin with a cold so sharp it almost felt clean. The light came in late, dragging itself over the hills beyond the fjord, and settled across the village with a pale, exhausted shimmer. Inside the longhouse, the air was thick with wood smoke, not unpleasant but heavy, clinging to your throat with every breath. You sat wrapped in your blanket on the edge of your pallet, watching as your mother moved about the hearth with slow, precise movements, her hair tied up in a knot that had come loose during the night, strands catching the firelight like thread spun from ash. Everyone was tired, not just from the cold or the labor, but from the days stacking up behind them, each one nearly identical to the one before. You could feel it in the way people moved, slower, more distracted. Even the children, usually the first to erupt into noise, had grown quieter, their games reduced to soft whispers and half-hearted pokes. The adults didn't speak unless necessary, and when they did, it was mostly in short phrases. No one was angry, not really, but the silence had shifted. It had grown heavy, not just shared, but burdened, as if the longhouse itself was beginning to sag under the weight of too many words left unsaid. You felt it too. That morning you'd argued with your sister over something so small you couldn't even remember it now. Perhaps it was whose turn it was to fetch more wood, or who had taken the last scrap of flatbread. It hadn't lasted long, just a sharp word and a glare, but it had sat between you all day like a cold stone. You had gone out to gather kindling with too much force, stabbing at the snowdrifts with your stick and hauling branches as if they had offended you personally. The wind had sliced across your face and turned your breath to ice, and your hands had gone red and raw from the effort. But it wasn't the cold or the work that stung. It was the knowledge that for a moment you had forgotten how much you relied on each other in that house. When you returned, the longhouse was quieter than usual. Your sister sat near the fire, mending a tear in her tunic. Her face was tight, but her hands were steady. She didn't look up when you entered, and you didn't speak. You stomped the snow from your boots, wiped your hands on your cloak, and moved to the storage crates to stack the kindling without a word. Frey gave you a quick glance as if to ask if it had passed, and you shrugged in reply. These things happened. Tempers flared like dry wood. The trick was not letting them burn the house down. That afternoon, while the stew simmered and the light outside began to fade once more, your aunt asked you to help her mend one of the sleeping mats. The stitching had come loose at one end, and the straw inside had begun to poke through, scratching whoever slept nearest. You sat across from her on the floor, the mat spread between you, and began to work in silence. She handed you a needle and a length of coarse thread, and you bent over the edge of the mat, fingers stiff but practiced. The straw rustled with every movement, and the thread squeaked faintly as it passed through the fabric. It was repetitive work, slow and dull, but there was something calming in the rhythm of it. After a while, your aunt began to hum softly, a low tune without words that swayed gently in time with the needle. You recognized it, an old lullaby sung in midsummer when the air was sweet with grass and the children fell asleep outside beneath the stars. It sounded strange in winter, like hearing birdsong in a cave, but it warmed the space between you, made the silence feel less like a wall and more like a blanket. You found yourself humming along, just a little, and she gave you a glance that said more than words. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Later, your sister joined you. She knelt beside the other end of the mat and began tying knots in the finished thread. She didn't say anything either, but her closeness was apology enough. That evening the stew was watery, but no one complained. It was made mostly of boiled roots and a few scraps of dried fish, thinned with the last of the broth from the smoked bones stored near the rafters. You sat shoulder to shoulder with your sister, your bowls resting on your knees, steam rising in soft curls that caught the dim firelight. She bumped your elbow lightly with hers and smirked. You rolled your eyes, but smiled back. The tension from the suzz at morning had melted into something quieter, easier to carry. Frey made a joke about the fish tasting like it had forgotten how to be a fish, and someone else laughed too loudly, as if glad to have a reason. For a few minutes the longhouse felt lighter, the shadows less dense, the cold further away. As night settled in and the fire was reduced to a bed of glowing embers, your father told you to bring in more logs. You rose and pulled on your cloak, stepping out into the night with Frey trailing behind you. The snow had hardened into a brittle crust, and it crunched underfoot as you crossed to the woodpile. The moon was high, veiled behind thin clouds, casting a soft, pearly light across the drifts. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see by. You each took an armful of logs, cradling them against your chest as you turned to head back. Frey paused and looked out across the fjord. His breath rose in slow clouds as he spoke, his voice quiet and even. He said that sometimes he worried they wouldn't make it through. Not in a dramatic way, but like someone confessing a thought they hadn't dared give shape to. You didn't answer right away. You just stood beside him, the logs growing heavier in your arms, the silence stretching long and soft around you. Then you told him that you thought the same thing sometimes, and that maybe everyone did, but also that maybe it didn't matter so much whether you believed you'd make it, as long as you kept doing the things that would help you try. He didn't respond, just gave a nod so slight it might have been a shiver, and together you walked back toward the longhouse, the warmth inside promising its own kind of answer. That night, as you lay once more beneath the firs, the smell of wood smoke thick in your hair and the warmth of your family pressed in around you, you listened to the sound of breathing and the creak of the roof and the faint hiss of wind along the thatch. The quiet no longer felt oppressive, it felt earned, and as your eyes grew heavy and your thoughts slowed, you felt a small, steady certainty in your chest. Not a grand hope, not a blazing light, but something smaller, the kind of warmth that came from mended mats and shared bowls, and apologies made with elbows instead of words. The kind of warmth that, if tended carefully, might just be enough to last until spring. The days had settled into a rhythm so subtle and slow that you hardly noticed it shaping you. Wake, tend to the fire, scrape the frost from the door, eat what could be spared, mend what had frayed, wait for the snow to shift or the light to change. Time did not move here the way it used to in the warm months. It didn't flow so much as it hovered, dense and still, like steam rising from the stew pot. You couldn't measure days by chores anymore because the chores never stopped. You measured them by the sound of someone coughing through the night, or the way the wind changed its tone against the longhouse wall. Sometimes you felt like you had been here forever, the cold sinking deeper into your skin, not just because of the season, but because the longhouse had grown smaller in a way you couldn't see, only feel. On this particular morning, the kind where the outside looked like powdered glass, and the inside like the last flicker of a candle, you awoke to the smell of wool being scorched. Someone had let a bit of cloth fall too close to the hearth during the night, and the edge of a blanket had blackened in silence until the smoke gave it away. It hadn't caught, only singed, but it was enough to send everyone into motion with more urgency than usual. Your mother cursed under her breath as she stomped out the ember with her boot, then held the blanket up to examine the damage. Your father was already at the door, checking for any remaining smoke that might have worked its way into the thatch. Even Frey looked unsettled, his usually steady hands twitching slightly as he stirred the fire to ensure it hadn't crept into the logs beneath. It passed quickly, but the tension hung in the air like a scent that couldn't be scrubbed away. Everyone moved more cautiously that day. The children played quieter, and the laughter that did emerge felt thinner, like it might snap under too much weight. You found yourself glancing at the hearth more than usual, checking for signs of trouble even when none were there. The heat, once comforting, now seemed slightly too bright. Your mother set the burned blanket aside with a sigh, muttering that it would need patching, though they were already short on cloth. No one responded. There was nothing to say. Later, you volunteered to fetch water from the stream near the tree line, though you knew it meant breaking the ice and soaking your sleeves. The cold bit hard today, and your breath came out in quick, sharp bursts as you walked. The path was familiar, but each snowfall made it new again, covering the landmarks and flattening the world into something wide and white and unknowable. You carried the buckets with one hand each, switching sides to balance the weight, and tried not to slip on the hard-packed snow that lay beneath the fresh powder. When you reached the stream, the ice was thicker than before, the surface glossy and unbroken except where the current still flowed beneath in slow pulses. You knelt carefully, chipped away the edge with your knife, and scooped the icy water into your buckets, the cold shocking your skin through the wool of your gloves. On the walk back, your fingers grew numb, and the ache in your shoulders reminded you of the weight you had carried all season, not just in the buckets, but in your body. The longhouse looked like a pile of snow itself from a distance, the roof nearly buried, smoke rising in lazy spirals into the still sky. As you approached, you heard the low murmur of voices inside, the sound of wood being chopped in the distance, and somewhere, a child singing a half-remembered song with no tune. You stepped through the door and were met with a burst of warm air that fogged your vision for a moment. The smell of stew had returned, faint but familiar, and someone was baking flat cakes on the hearthstone. Your sister took the buckets without a word, her hands brushing yours just briefly, and set them beside the barrel in the corner. You sat down near the fire, rubbing your hands together until the pins and needles set in, painful but welcome. Frey was repairing a bit of sled harness, muttering to himself about a buckle that wouldn't sit right. Your aunt was mending the singed blanket, sewing a patch cut from an old tunic onto the charred edge. The needle passed through the cloth with a quiet rhythm, and she hummed under her breath as she worked, not the same tune as before, but something softer, slower. Your cousin was drawing shapes in the soot near the hearth, his finger tracing loops and spirals in the grey dust. No one scolded him. It gave him something to do, and it didn't cost anything. As the day wore on, the air grew heavier. The sky outside darkened early, not from clouds, but from that peculiar winter gloom that arrived without warning and made the walls feel closer. The light from the fire flickered more brightly as the room dimmed, and everyone settled into their tasks with that quiet focus that only comes when there is no room for distraction. You and Frey ended up working together again, this time sorting through a tangled pile of rope and salvaging the usable lengths. He didn't speak much, but you didn't need him to. The way he handed you the frayed ends and nodded toward the hearth said enough. You worked until your hands were raw with vipers, and the pile had been transformed from a useless tangle into neat coils ready for use. That night, the stew was better than usual. Someone had found a strip of dried venison in the back of the larder, and it gave the broth a richness that made everyone pause on the first bite. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw a quiet hum of appreciation around the room. Even your uncle, who rarely spoke at meals, looked up and offered a brief smile before returning to his bowl. The warmth in your chest had nothing to do with the food. It was the sound of others eating, the way no one rushed, the way the fire crackled between you all like a shared secret. After the bowls were cleaned and the children put to bed, you sat near the fire with Frey again, each of you cradling a mug of weak ale your father had brewed from the last of the grain. It was sour and thin, but it warmed your throat, and the act of drinking together felt like ceremony. Frey looked into the flames for a long time before speaking, his voice low and steady. He said he missed the sea, not the fishing or the danger, but the way the air moved, how it always felt alive. You nodded. You missed it too, though you hadn't realized it until now. The wind, the spray, even the stink of the nets. It had been a kind of freedom, even in its difficulty. Frey looked over at you then, not smiling, but not somber either. He said this winter had taught him something he hadn't wanted to learn. That being still could be its own kind of strength. That not running, not fleeing, not filling every silence with noise or movement. That took more from him than he'd tea.
Haughty had. You didn't answer. You just sipped your drink, the fire warm against your face, and let the silence sit with you both like an old friend.
As the fire burned down and the longhouse drifted towards sleep once more, you lay down beneath your blanket and let your body sink into the warm softness of the mat. Around you, the quiet filled the space like snow, slow and deep and forgiving. The air was cold but not cruel, the night long but not empty. And as your thoughts slipped towards sleep, you held on to one small truth, as simple and firm as the beat of your own heart. Whatever tomorrow brought, you wouldn't face it alone. The snow had started again sometime in the early hours of the morning. Not the heavy, wind-blown kind that clawed at the eaves and rattled the shutters, but the quiet kind that fell like breath from the sky, settling over everything in soft, steady layers. When you stepped outside to relieve yourself before the rest of the house stirred, the world had become a place of muffled sounds and blurred edges. Each tree was outlined in white, each path erased, and even the air felt slower, like the snow had convinced it to drift more gently around your face. You stood still for a while, your breath forming clouds in front of you, and watched the flakes land on your sleeve and disappear. The stillness was so complete it felt sacred, as though speaking too loudly might crack the sky. Inside, the longhouse remained hushed, the fire low but alive, aglow beneath the blackened logs that waited patiently for more wood. You added a few small branches and knelt there, arms wrapped around your knees, watching the flames begin to rise. The scent of smoke clung to everything now, your clothes, your hair, your skin. But it had become a kind of comfort, a marker of continuity, a sign that something still held its place in the world, even as the cold pressed in deeper each day. You rubbed your hands together slowly, your fingers stiff with the chill, and let the heat seep into your skin inch by inch. One by one, the others began to stir. Your mother moved through the room with her usual quiet grace, tying back her hair and checking the stores without a word. Frey yawned and stretched, his arms arching over his head until his joints cracked, then pulled on his tunic without comment. Your sister, already half-dressed, sat combing the knots from her hair with the bone comb she kept tucked beneath her pillow. No one said much at first, and there was a kind of peace in that silence. It wasn't empty, just understood. Words would come later, once the fire was fully lit, and the air warm enough to carry them. Breakfast was thin gruel again, made from the last of the crushed oats and some rehydrated berries your aunt had found, hidden beneath a sack of dried moss. The berries gave it colour and a whisper of sweetness, and though the portions were small, no one complained. You ate slowly, chewing with purpose, letting the warmth fill you from within. Across from you, your uncle leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed, the bowl balanced on his lap. He'd been coughing more lately, a rough, wet sound that lingered long after the fit had passed. No one spoke of it directly, but your mother had started steeping stronger teas from the dried herbs in the rafters, and your cousin now slept closer to the wall where the cold came in more easily, giving your uncle a warmer place near the hearth. After the meal, the children began playing a quiet game with carved figures near the door, arranging them in circles and pretending they were holding counsel about a stolen goat. Their voices drifted in and out like a breeze, sometimes serious, sometimes erupting in giggles that broke the stillness and reminded everyone how young they still were, even if their faces had grown sharper with the cold. You watched them from your seat near the fire, hands busy, repairing the cracked handle of a small spade, a and felt a pang of something that was not quite envy, not quite sadness, just the awareness that once you two had seen the long winter days as endless hours for play rather than slow survival. Later, your mother suggested something unexpected. She wanted to hold a small blot, nothing grand, just a simple offering to the household spirits and the ancestors who watched over them. Not because she thought it would change the weather or bring back the sun, but because it was what had always been done in times like these. She said it without ceremony, her voice low but steady, and there was a murmur of assent around the room. Even your father, who had grown more pragmatic with each passing season, nodded once and began gathering the small bundle of dried herbs and bones from the far corner where they'd been tucked away since harvest. You helped prepare the space, clearing a circle near the hearth and arranging the offerings in the old pattern your grandmother had taught you. A ring of stones, each one warmed by the fire before being placed, a bowl of broth steeped with onions and bone marrow, a curl of birch bark scrawled with runes. None of you could quite remember how to read. It didn't matter. The act itself was what counted. The memory in your fingers as you worked, the smell of the herbs releasing their oils as they touched the hot stones. The sound of your aunt humming that old melody again as she crushed dried sage between her palms. When the time came, everyone gathered in a loose circle. The children held hands, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Your mother spoke the old words, or something close to them, her voice soft but carrying. She thanked the spirits for the roof that had not fallen, for the food that had not spoiled, for the breath that still filled their lungs each morning. She asked for nothing more than endurance, and perhaps, when it was time, a thaw that would come gently. No one closed their eyes, but everyone listened. When she finished, there was a pause, and then your uncle raised his cup and drank, and the rest followed, even the youngest sipping from a shared bowl of warm tea. The fire popped and shifted, and for a moment it felt like something unseen had nodded in approval. That night, the mood in the longhouse was different, not cheerful, exactly, but softer, as if the ritual had dusted the air with something gentle, something remembered. Your father told a story from his own childhood about the time a bear had wandered too close to their goat pen and been scared off by his mother's yelling. He mimicked her voice, high and furious, and the room erupted in laughter so loud and sudden that the children covered their mouths as if surprised by their own noise. Even your uncle chuckled, his cough forgotten for a moment, and Frey leaned against you as he laughed, his shoulder warm and solid beside yours. You slept deeply that night, more deeply than you had in weeks. The blanket felt heavier, the mat softer, the sounds of breathing around you like the tide on a quiet shore. When you dreamed not of the cold or the dark, but of green hills and sun on your face, of your mother's hands in the soil and the smell of bread baking in an oven long cold. You awoke before the others, the fire still glowing faintly, and sat up slowly, listening to the hush. Outside, the snow still fell, but softer now, as if the sky had been calmed. You stood, wrapped in your cloak, and pressed a hand to the wood of the door, feeling the chill through the grain. Spring was still far off. The food stores were still low. The cold would not relent easily. But something inside you had shifted, not with noise or flash, but with the quiet certainty that you were not alone and never had been. And that was enough. The quiet that followed the ritual lingered like a warm mist in the longhouse, not visible or loud, but present in the way voices softened and movements slowed with care. It was as though everyone had been given permission to breathe a little more deeply, to lean a little closer, to release the tight knots they had been carrying in their shoulders since the first snowfall. The fire burned a little brighter that evening, though no more wood had been added than usual. You had sat with your back against the post near the hearth, legs folded beneath you, watching your mother's hands as she twisted new cordage from frayed ends of rope, her fingers moving with a rhythm that belonged to generations before her. The light had caught in the tiny silver hairs along her temples, and for a moment you had seen her, not just as your mother, but as a girl once taught to work this same task under a different roof, with different hands, guiding her own. But peace in winter was always fragile. It never held long enough to be trusted fully. The next morning, you woke to the sound of coughing that didn't belong to the usual rustle of morning routine. It was harsher than before, a deep, racking sound that echoed off the rafters and made even the children pause mid-step. You turned your head toward the far end of the longhouse, and there, propped against the wall with sweat glistening on his brow, despite the cold, was your uncle. His blanket was pushed down around his waist, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to sit up straight. Your mother was already beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his chest, speaking softly in that tone she used only when something serious was happening, but she didn't want to alarm the others. You moved closer slowly, heart thudding, eyes flicking between your uncle's face and your mother's. He looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in presence, like someone who had stepped back slightly from the world and wasn't sure if he'd return. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, and each one seemed to cost him something. Your cousin hovered nearby, face pale, hands clenched into fists. Frey stood just behind you, not moving, not speaking, but close enough that you could feel the heat of him, like a steadying anchor. There wasn't much to be done. No healer lived nearby, and the herbal mixtures had long since been brewed and used. Your mother whispered about elderberry and boiled pine bark, about warming stones wrapped in cloth to place at his feet, about sleep and stillness and the hope that the worst would pass. You helped where you could, bringing water, holding the edge of the blanket as she changed the padding beneath him, but mostly you watched, and you waited. Time shifted again, not in hours or chores, but in the shallow rise and fall of your uncle's chest. The longhouse dimmed, even though the day outside was still pale with snowlight. Conversations dropped to whispers, and even the children played more quietly, their games now confined to corners away from the hearth. Meals were skipped or forgotten, the stew pot left half full. Your mother kept her vigil while your aunt sat beside her husband, humming softly, her hand pressed to his forehead, her lips moving in silent prayer. You found yourself outside more often that day, taking any excuse to gather more snow for water, to fetch extra wood, to chop kindling, even when no one asked. The cold on your skin was harsh, but it cleared the noise from your head, gave your hands something solid to work against. By the time the sky began to darken again, a hush had fallen so completely across the longhouse that even the crackle of the fire felt loud. You returned from one of your many trips outside, boots caked with ice, cheeks raw, and stepped inside to find your uncle sleeping more deeply than he had all day. The coughing had stopped, and for a terrifying moment you thought he had stopped breathing entirely, but then you saw the faint movement beneath the blanket, slow, but there. Your aunt looked up at you with tired eyes and gave the smallest nod. You nodded back. No words were needed. He was still here. That night, no stories were told, no songs were sung, but the quiet wasn't hollow. It was reverent, protective. Each movement was made with care, each word spoken with softness. When the evening meal was served, just broth and a few strips of smoked fish. Everyone ate in silence, the warmth of the food enough to pull some of the weariness from their bones. Your sister sat beside you, and, though she didn't speak, she laid her head on your shoulder for a brief moment before rising to help your mother rinse the bowls. Frey passed you a blanket when he noticed you rubbing your arms for warmth, and when you finally lay down, the weight of the day settled over you like another layer of wool. Heavy, but necessary. The days that followed moved with the same careful pace. Your uncle remained ill, but stable. The coughing came and went, and your mother stayed near him with her teas and poultices and quiet, determined strength. Your father took over more of the work, gathering snow for water, tending the fire, overseeing the small repairs that never ceased. You found yourself stepping into his shadow more often, matching his pace, carrying what he carried, not to prove anything but because it felt right. There was something grounding in his silence, in the way he moved through each tase, without complaint or flourish. You learned from him in those quiet hours, not in words but in repetition, in the steady cadence of doing what needed to be done, again and again, no matter how tired you felt. One afternoon, as you sat mending a cracked basket near the door, your cousin came and joined you. He didn't speak for a long while, just picked up one of the broken reeds and began weaving it back into place. His hands were smaller than yours, but nimble. His face, usually bright with mischief, was drawn and serious. After a while he said that he had been afraid his father wouldn't wake up. That he still was. You looked at him, unsure of what to say, and in the end you told him the truth. That you were afraid too, that it was all right to be, but also that he wasn't alone, that none of you were. He didn't answer, but he stayed beside you until the basket was whole again. That night, your uncle asked for water on his own. His voice was weak, barely more than a breath, but it was a sound of intent, of presence. You helped him sit up, bracing his back with your arm, and held the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, but with purpose. When he was done, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered his thanks. You didn't know if it was for the water or for more than that, but you nodded anyway, and sat with him until he drifted off again. The fire burned low as you prepared for sleep, the embers glowing like quiet stars across the ash. You lay down and listened to the sounds around you. The rustle of someone adjusting their blanket, the crack of a log settling into the coals, the wind brushing gently against the outside wall, and beneath it all, the sound of breathing. Not just yours, not just one or two, but many. Together, overlapping, steady. A chorus of life in the stillness of winter. You closed your eyes and let it carry you, knowing that whatever came next, you would face it as you had faced this, as part of something larger than yourself, something quiet and worn and strong. The next morning came with a stillness so complete it felt like the world had paused, holding its breath just beyond the longhouse walls. The snow outside had deepened, smoothing over every uneven edge in the landscape, turning rocks and branches and even old footprints into soft mounds of white. The wind had died down overnight, leaving the air heavy and motionless, the kind of cold that didn't scream or cut, but crept in low and slow, like a tide around your ankles. When you opened your eyes, the fire had almost gone out again, the faintest glow humming from under a pile of ash, and your breath plumed visibly before you like mist in the dimness. You pulled the blanket around your shoulders and sat up, moving carefully, so as not to disturb the quiet that had settled over everything. Your uncle had slept through the night without coughing. That alone was enough to shift something in the longhouse, a loosening of the tight band that had wrapped itself around everyone's chest for days. You could feel it in the way your mother moved, lighter-footed, her shoulders not quite as stiff as she crossed to the hearth. You saw it in the way your aunt stayed seated beside her husband, her hands resting loosely in her lap, instead of twisted together in anxious knots. Even the children seemed to sense the change. They spoke a little more freely that morning, their voices still soft but no longer edged with the same tension. One of them even laughed, a quick burst of sound that startled the hens huddled near the storage crates and brought a faint smile to your father's face. Breakfast was modest but warm. Your sister had soaked bits of dried bread in broth overnight, and the resulting porridge was thick enough to chew, a rare comfort. You ate slowly, watching the steam curl upward from your bowl and mix with the fire smoke, your legs tucked beneath you for warmth. Across the hearth, Frey sat sharpening a bone needle with a sliver of stone, his face drawn in concentration, his lips moving in time with the rhythm of the strokes. It was a sound you had come to find soothing, that steady scrape and pause, the kind of sound that kept your thoughts from unraveling too quickly. Once the meal was done and the bowls cleaned, your father sent you and Frey to check the smokehouse. It was a task long overdue, put off during your uncle's illness, and though the path was half buried in snow, the sky was pale and open above you, the clouds high and stretched thin like worn wool. You trudged through the drifts in silence at first, your boots breaking the crusted top layer with soft crunches, your breath clouding before you. The trees around the smokehouse had gathered snow in every crook and curve, and the building itself looked like something forgotten, a crooked shadow under a blanket of white. But when you opened the door and stepped inside, the smell that greeted you was rich and steady. Smoked fish and drying herbs, the preservation of earlier labor still holding strong. You took inventory in the half-light, counting the bundles of preserved meat, tapping the barrels for ice build-up, checking the cords and lids. Frey spoke then, his voice low and close in the cold air. He said that the smokehouse always felt like a kind of promise, that as long as the smell was still strong and the hook still held weight, the worst hadn't yet won. You nodded without needing to respond, your fingers brushing the frost from a sealed jar of pickled greens. A small treasure you'd forgotten was even there. You pocketed it carefully, planning to bring it back as a surprise. Something bright and sharp to stir the palate after too many days of softness and salt. On the walk back, the silence between you and Frey took on a different texture, not heavy, not empty, but full in a way that didn't need filling. You moved in rhythm, step for step, the snow crunching beneath you like a shared heartbeat. And when you reached the longhouse, the warmth inside was waiting like a familiar voice calling your name. The rest of the day was quiet. Your uncle slept through much of it, waking only to drink and nod at the words spoken to him, his strength returning slowly but surely. Your mother spent the afternoon preparing medicinal pastes from dried plants and animal fat, mixing and heating them over the fire with careful hands. Your cousin joined her, watching each step with wide eyes, learning not from instruction, but from repetition, the same way you had learned how to patch a boot or cure fish. Your sister began spinning wool again, her dropped spindle dancing just slightly in her fingers. The fibers forming threads that she wound around her wrist like bracelets. Even the youngest children sat in clusters, combing through seed husks and separating the ones still useful, turning the chore into a game of discovery. By evening, the longhouse felt more like itself again. Your father recounted the last time snow had fallen this heavy, a story from before you were born, about a neighbor who built tunnels between houses using old ship timbers and had nearly caused the entire roof to collapse. Your mother rolled her eyes as he told it, but she didn't stop him, and by the time he reached the part where the neighbor's goat had found its way into their stew pot, the whole room was laughing, even your aunt, who hadn't smiled in days. The sound filled the space with something warmer than fire, something older and deeper than any stew. That night, you sat near the door with your sister, helping her twist wool into longer threads, your fingers working in cue. Quiet coordination. She spoke softly about the herbs your mother had been using, wondering aloud if she might learn them too, might remember which bark soothed fevers and which root calmed the belly. You encouraged her, your voice just as soft, telling her that such knowledge was as important as any sword or spear, especially now when survival meant more than fighting. She smiled, not broadly, but with purpose, and together you worked until your hands grew tired and the fire dimmed low. As you laid down to sleep, the sound of your uncle's breathing was stronger than it had been in days, the air less strained in his chest, the rhythm more sure. You listened, with your eyes closed, your body curled beneath the furs, and let the calm settle over you. The snow still fell outside, and the world beyond the longhouse remained buried and still. But inside, the hearth glowed, the threads held, and the silence spoke of something more than survival. It spoke of care taken, of burdens shared, of small hopes gathered like embers in a cold wind. The morning light came late, but it came with clarity, as though the sky had finally remembered how to hold brightness. It was the kind of soft, silvery light that filled the longhouse slowly, beginning as a faint glow in the cracks between the planks, and then washing across the rafters like spilled milk. You opened your eyes to the sound of footsteps brushing gently across the packed earth floor, the faint clang of metal against stone, and the creak of someone adjusting the iron hook above the fire. The scent of pine smoke hung low in the air, mingled now with a touch of boiled roots and the slightly sour warmth of yesterday's broth being stirred back to life. For a moment you stayed still beneath your blanket, letting the warmth of your own breath linger near your face, listening to the sounds of a house not in crisis, but simply alive wit.
Motion.
Your uncle was still asleep, his face turned slightly toward the wall, his breath now steady enough that no one flinched with each exhale. Your aunt was seated beside him, as she had been every morning for the last stretch of days, her hands moving slowly over a strip of linen she had begun to embroider before the snow had thickened. The red thread wound in small, even patterns, a modest geometric design that had once been meant for the hem of a tunic. Now it had become something else, a way to mark the passage of time in color and shape, a thing to keep the hands busy while the heart waited. You rose slowly, pulling on your cloak, the wool stiff from the cold where it had slipped to the floor overnight. As you crossed to the hearth, your mother handed you a bowl without speaking, the warmth of it passing through your palms like a greeting. You ate beside the fire, knees drawn up, watching the thin curls of steam dance and disappear. The food was simple, but it tasted good, not because it was different, but because it was familiar, expected, a ritual that gave shape to the morning. The kind of meal that said we are still here, still doing this, still trying. Later, your father suggested you take one of the boys to check the animal pen. Though you both knew the animals had long since been brought inside or slaughtered, their meat preserved in the smokehouse. Still, it was important to check, to clear the snow from the roof of the lean-to and ensure no cracks had formed in the wood. You chose the younger of your two cousins, the quiet one, with the round eyes and a habit of clutching his coat too tightly. He looked surprised to be asked, but didn't hesitate. Together, you pulled on boots, bundled yourselves against the cold, and stepped outside. The snow was high now, a smooth white surface that reached nearly to your waist in the deeper drifts. The path your father had carved, that a days before had softened again beneath the weight of the most recent fall. The two of you walked slowly, your cousin watching your steps and mimicking them exactly, as if worried the snow might swallow him if he strayed. The sky was pale and clouded, but not threatening. The cold was deep, but dry, the kind that didn't sting so much as numb. You could hear the faint crackle of frost underfoot, and the occasional groan of distant trees shifting in their frozen bark. The animal shelter was intact, though the snow had nearly buried the lower walls. You used the flat side of your axe to knock the ice from the beams and cleared the small entrance with a few strong kicks. Inside, the air was close and still, and a few forgotten tools hung from the back wall, rimmed with frost. Your cousin asked if you thought the snow would stop soon. You didn't lie, you said you didn't know, but you hoped so. He nodded slowly, then leaned against your side for a moment, just long enough to feel your steadiness. You didn't move, you let him stand there until he was ready, then nudged him back toward the longhouse, your boots leaving deep prints that the wind had already begun to fill. Back inside, your sister was grinding dried roots into powder, her face half covered in a cloth to keep the dust from her lungs. Your mother supervised from nearby, showing her how to fold the crushed mixture into waxed cloth pouches that could be boiled later into medicinal teas. You sat for a while and watched them work, the rhythm of the mortar and pestle almost hypnotic, the soft murmurs between them soothing in their quiet focus. Frey was carving again, this time working on a long spoon with a gently curved handle. He had taken to whittling most days, saying little, letting his hands speak in shape and grain. His pile of finished pieces was growing, bowls, combs, simple tools, each one sanded smooth and stacked carefully near the door. No one had asked him to do it. He simply had. Like your aunt with her embroidery. Like you with your walks and chores. Everyone finding something to shape, something to mend, to give their hands a reason to move when the hours stretched too wide. That evening, your father brought out a small leather pouch from his chest. Inside were a few carved tokens worn smooth by time and use. Game pieces, he set them on the floor near the hearth, and soon the children gathered, eyes wide with the quiet thrill of something different. The game was simple, moving pieces across a marked surface in patterns meant to mimic old stories of battle and voyage, but it was enough to stir a kind of energy in the room that had not been there for days. You watched as laughter returned in fits and starts, not forced, but discovered, like a buried thing uncovered by accident. Even your cousin, who had been so still beside your uncle's bed, joined the circle and played, his focus intense, his hands steady as he moved his token with care. Later, after the children had been sent to their blankets and the fire had been stoked for the night, you sat with your mother. Near the embers, she was darning a pair of mittens, her fingers moving almost without thought, She spoke quietly, not to instruct or correct, but to share. She told you about her own winters as a girl, of the way snow used to fall so heavily it would silence the world for days, and of the stories her mother told to keep their spirits strong. She remembered a year when the ice had grown so thick on the fjord that a neighbour had walked across it to another village, returning with tales of a feast and a bundle of dried fruit tucked into the folds of his coat. She said winters had always tested people, but also that they had always revealed something too, something about what truly held a family together. As she spoke, you felt the shape of her words settle inside you, not like answers, but like anchors. Things to hold on to when the wind rose or the night felt too long. And when she grew quiet again, her thread nearly finished, you sat beside her in the silence, warmed by more than fire. Sleep came easily that night. The longhouse was filled with the sound of breathing, of soft shifts and murmurs, of life held gently in the dark. The cold remained outside, pressing against the walls like a question, but inside the answer had already been given. In bowls passed hand to hand, in threads pulled tight, in snow brushed from roofs, in stories quietly told. You closed your eyes and let the warmth of those answers carry you into sleep, the kind that holds you close and does not let go. The days had begun to stretch again, not by much, just enough that you noticed the light lingering a little longer against the wooden beams, the way the sun touched the floor near the doorpost just a finger's breadth farther than it had a week ago. It was the kind of change you didn't dare name aloud for fear of jinxing it, but it was there all the same, folded into the air like a secret. The longhouse remained sealed tight against the cold, and the drifts outside still came up past your thighs in places, but something was shifting, slowly and gently, like breath returning to a body after sleep. Even the wind, which had howled so often and so fiercely during the deep of winter, now came in sighs, brushing against the walls as if testing them rather than battering them. You felt it in your body too, the way your hands no longer stiffened quite so quickly each morning, how your joints ached less with every trip to the woodpile. You still wrapped yourself in layers before stepping outside, still tucked your hands beneath your arms for warmth as you walked, but there was a looseness in your spine now, a readiness that hadn't been there in the darkest weeks. Frey had noticed it too. You caught him humming again as he worked, low and tuneless, a thing done without thought, like breathing. He whittled more now, not just tools, but small animals for the children, and one afternoon he handed you a tiny bird he'd carved from a scrap of driftwood. It had no markings, no elaborate detail, just the suggestion of wings and a beak, but you held it in your palm like a treasure and didn't let go of it for a long while. Inside the longhouse, the days passed with their familiar rhythm, but there was a softness to them now, a kind of grace that only comes after fear has loosened its grip. Your uncle had begun to sit up more often, wrapped in blankets and propped against the wall. He still, Al coughed from time to time, still moved slowly, but his eyes had regained their steadiness, and he no longer drifted off in the middle of conversations. Your aunt had started singing again in the evenings, old lullabies that didn't quite follow a tune, but settled in the air like the smell of warm bread. The children responded to the change too, more willing to help without being asked, more inclined to stay still when asked to listen. It wasn't obedience born of discipline, but of understanding. They had seen how thin the line could be between comfort and worry, and they didn't want to pull it tight again. One morning your mother began sorting the seed sacks. It was far too early to plant, of course. The ground was still locked in frost, and the snow wouldn't fully melt for weeks yet. But she said it was good to know what they had, to see what might still be possible come spring. You sat beside her as she untied each bundle, her fingers moving with care through the small piles of dried peas and barley, the last of the flax, a few handfuls of mustard seeds that had been saved from the year before. She laid them out on a cloth, counting them softly under her breath, and you realized she wasn't just counting seeds. She was measuring hope. You helped her tie the bundles again, double knotting the cords, tucking them back into their place above the hearth, where the smoke would keep the damp away. When you were done, she touched your hand gently and said nothing, but her eyes said enough. That same afternoon, your father took you and Frey out beyond the tree line to inspect the sleds. It was the first time you'd gone that far from the longhouse in over a month, and the air beyond the trees felt different, thinner and sharper. The sleds were buried, their wooden frames half sunk beneath frozen mounds, but you could still see the edges where the iron runners had cut into the snow. It took the three of you the better part of an hour to uncover them, and longer still to test the wood, to oil the joints, to replace the leather lashings where they had cracked from the cold. Your hands went numb twice, and Frey nicked his finger on a rusted nail, but by the time you finished, 2 of the sleds were usable again and the third needed only a new crossbeam. Your father looked at them with quiet approval, then looked toward the distant slope where the tree line dipped toward the frozen fjord. He said, almost to himself, that the ice would hold another few weeks at least, that if the need arose, the sleds would get you across. Back home, your sister had taken over the task of braiding cord for the fishing nets, her fingers nimble and sure. She'd grown taller during the winter, though no one had marked it until now, and her shoulders no longer sloped inward like they used to. She sat with her legs crossed, humming the same tune your aunt sang, the thread dancing between her hands like a tame snake. You watched her for a while, then took a seat beside her, picking up the next bundle of cord. It didn't matter if it was too early to think of fishing. Like the seeds, the nets had to be ready. Readiness was its own form of faith. That evening, a soft snow began to fall again, the kind that melted on contact with the wood, that whispered rather than landed. You watched it through the small gap in the door, your fingers wrapped around a mug of thin ale your father had brewed from the dregs of the last grain sack. It tasted of smoke and thyme, and it warmed your throat as you drank. Your uncle sat nearby, a blanket around his shoulders, speaking quietly with your cousin about how to check the traps once the thaw began. His voice was still rough, but it held a rhythm now, a kind of forward motion that gave shape to the future. Before bed, your aunt lit a small candle and set it on the hearth, not for light, but for memory. She said it was for the ones who hadn't made it through the last winter, for her sister's child who'd been lost to fever, for the elder who used to live by the ridge and whose stories had once filled a room like a feast. She didn't cry, and no one asked her to explain. The candle burned low as the fire dimmed, its glow flickering in the corners, like a presence that needed no name. You lay down with the carved bird still in your palm, its edges smoothed by your touch, its shape warming slowly against your skin. Around you, the sound of sleep returned, gentle breathing, the occasional shift of fabric, the creak of the beams as the house settled for the night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not heavy, but with intent, a slow layering of softness that covered the world inch by inch. You closed your eyes and listened to the quiet and let it fill you, not as an ending, but as a place to rest before the next step. The morning light felt different as you awoke. It still came late, but when it finally arrived, it carried a faint warmth in its glow. The snow outside no longer gleamed in stark white, but in a softer hue, as though the world had been washed in pale honey and begun to mellow. You rose carefully from beneath your blankets, every muscle slow and deliberate, mindful of the ache in your shoulders and knees. The longhouse around you was still, not silent, but restful, hushed like a room holding a conversation meant for tomorrow. You paused by the door, pressing your palm to the wood and feeling the faint vibration of life beyond the walls. You couldn't see movement, but you knew it was there, folded deep under ice and snow, waiting. Inside, the fire had been rekindled, and its glow reached farther than it had in weeks, painting gentle gold across the beams and warming the air by the hearth. Your father stood by the fire with your uncle, speaking softly in Norse, the words rolling between them like stones in a slow stream. Your mother was kneeling before the smokehouse door, tying the latch firmly so that any smouldering embers from the previous night's cold wouldn't wake the fire again in those hidden chambers. Behind her, your aunt moved among the sleeping children, brushing stray hairs from their faces, adjusting furs against their small bodies. Their cheeks had colour again, not the rosy flush of fever or the pallor of hunger, but the bright bloom of health returning. You swallowed, feeling a tight warmth in your chest. It was hope, that simple, unadorned feeling, rising like steam from the morning brew. You took a bowl of thin gruel from your mother's hand, sitting near the warmest part of the room, where steam rose off the wooden floorboards. Flakes of snow melted on your cloak, leaving soft puddles around your feet that steamed slightly as they met the hearth's warmth. You sipped the porridge slowly, letting the heat settle in your stomach and push outward into your limbs. Your mind lingered on the edges of sleep, where the longhouse had felt so fragile. But now there was shape to your days again, purpose, the simple order of living becoming an anchor. Later your father gathered you and two of your cousins. He said that the spring thaw had begun at the forest edge and that they'd found a maple grove where sap still ran thinly from the trunks. It was a thing of joyous planning. You would collect sap, boil it down, make a syrup or sugar to sweeten the hard stew, and add a shimmer of sweetness to flat cakes. It was a task that promised warmth and transformation, like the season itself. You wrapped yourself in fur and waxcloth and stepped outside, the longhouse breathing a soft breath behind you as you emerged into the world. The sky was a pale blue, not the white veil of winter, but a colour that held space for more. Snowdrifts were high, but a path had opened where the wind and thaw had worked in tandem. You clung to your father's side, holding a carved staff to steady yourself as you stepped over hardened drifts and melted patches. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth, the faintest hint of water running unseen beneath frozen white. Your boots crunched and sloshed, and each step felt like a promise to yourself and everyone back home. You reached the grove by midday. The trees stood bare and bright, their trunks marked with clean cuts where previous years' sap had been gathered. Your father showed you how to shave a small notch near the base of each tree, insert a wooden spile, and hang a willow shield pot beneath to catch the sap. Your cousins followed suit, pressing soft lips to the spout to see if it still flowed. The sap was cold but sweet, and you all laughed when it dribbled onto the snow. You carried your carved bird in your pocket, its smooth shape a quiet companion as you worked. Frey didn't speak much, but when he arrived later to help, your smile met his. Together you checked each tap, resetting spiles, clearing snow from rimmed pots. He handed you small trimmed branches to scoop sap into a larger wooden bucket he carried down to a clearing. The sun felt real on your back, warm enough to coax sweat from beneath wool. but not so warm that it felt wrong. You bent to collect a half bucket full before the sun touched the tops of the trees and whispered that it was time to return. The walk home felt lighter. Snow seemed less oppressive now, a soft roller under your feet rather than a burden. Re-entry into the longhouse was quiet celebration. Jugs were filled, logs stoked, whispers of gratitude and anticipation passed around. Your mother kept the fire low and steady as your aunt set up a clay pot over it to boil sap with a handful of barley husks to filter it. The children watched with wide eyes as steam rose, thick and silver, from the bubbling sap. The whole room smelled of maple and smoke, sweet with the beginnings of change. As the sap reduced throughout the afternoon, conversation returned in earnest. Your uncle spoke of a spring he once saw so early that green shoots appeared like miracles at his feet, and your father responded with laughter, reminding him of the year a late bolt of frost blackened their garden. Your sister showed off her spinach leaves grown from seed last season, tiny pale sprigs pushed through frozen soil to surprise you in an old bucket. Your aunt dipped a spoon into the syrup broth and let it cool before savouring it slowly, crossing her eyes as the heat and sweetness struck her tongue. Dinner that evening was richer than any in weeks. A flat cake drizzled with fresh syrup was shared around. It tasted of sunlight and promise. Even the broth, made from preserved roots and salted fish, felt different, the sweetness lending it a gentle lift. Laughter came more freely now, easing back into the room like a bird returning to its nest. The game pieces were brought out again as the candlelight grew dark around the edges and the fire softened to a bed of embers. When bedtime came, the longhouse hummed with contentment. You lay with your hand wrapped around the carved bird, now warm to the touch. Outside, the snow still lay deep, but the night air was gentler, and somewhere in the distance you thought you heard the drip of melting snow off the roof. Your thoughts drifted slow, following the warmth in your chest back to the sap, the syrup, the stillness that gave way to hope. The stories told and untold, the small acts of care and repair, had woven a new season into your souls. Spring would come in time. But for tonight, the sweetness of change was enough to carry you gently into sleep. The sun rose earlier now, not by much, but enough that the slant of light reached your bed mat before you stirred. You felt it before you saw it, a soft warmth against your eyelids. And when you opened them, the longhouse glowed with a colour it hadn't worn in many weeks. Not the yellow-orange flicker of firelight, but something truer, more familiar. The kind of brightness that belonged to days when doors could be left open and smoke drifted out instead of curling back in. You sat up slowly, blinking against the gentle gleam that spilled over the rafters and stretched long fingers across the packed earth floor. Around you, others had begun to stir, the soft rustle of blankets and the slow, sleepy groans of limbs that hadn't moved in hours. Someone yawned, and the sound broke like a wave against the hush, setting the tone for the day, a tone of stretching, rising, breathing deeply again. Your uncle was already awake, propped against the wall with a woolen shawl wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He looked better, still thinner than before the sickness, but now alert, his gaze steady, his voice clearer when he greeted you with a nod. You passed him a cup of warm tea your mother had brewed from dried raspberry leaves and water that had been boiled down from the melting snow. He drank it slowly, savouring each swallow like it was the first sip of spring. Across the room, your sister knelt beside the fire, coaxing it to full flame, her hair braided back, her face flushed with warmth and effort. There was a rhythm to her movement that made you smile, how she shifted the logs, tapped the ash from the iron pot, added sprigs of dry wing needle for scent. It was not rushed or forced, but done with care, with knowledge born of repetition. Breakfast was still modest, but now it felt like preparation rather than preservation. A few spoonfuls of syrup had been folded into oat cakes, and though the flour was coarse and the cakes slightly burned on the edges, they were devoured eagerly. Your cousin had taken to stacking his into a tower and then pretending to topple it before each bite. No one scolded him. The laughter it brought was worth the crumbs on the floor. As you ate, you noticed that your father had already begun gathering tools by the door, an old hoe, a long-handled rake, the broken-spined shovel that had been repaired with bone rivets back in early winter. It wasn't planting time yet, but soon, very soon. The ground had started to soften beneath the snow, and when the melt was complete, it would be ready. That afternoon you joined your father in clearing the edge of the field. The snow there was shallow now, grey with dirt and leaf fragments, sinking underfoot with every step. Together you dragged away branches that had fallen during the storms, stacking. Gee them near the woodshed too, dry out for kindling. The earth beneath your boots was spongy in places, and in others still, frozen like iron, but even the air smelled different, rich and loamy, like wet bark and moss. You knelt to press your palm into the ground, and it gave slightly, releasing the scent of last year's soil, of roots waiting just beneath the surface. Your father didn't say much, but when he looked at you, there was pride in his eyes, not loud or exaggerated, just there, like the sun. The children had started playing outside again. They were bundled in cloaks and scarves, but no longer afraid of the wind. They made crude sleds from scrap wood and rode them down the smallest slope near the fence, their laughter echoing across the field like birdsong. You paused in your work more than once to watch them, a smile pulling at your mouth without asking permission. It was in their play that the season truly turned, not in temperature or calendar, but in spirit, in their willingness to chase joy again, even when the ground was wet and the sky uncertain. Later, your mother called everyone inside to help with the garden plans. She unrolled a piece of hide across the table and laid out small stones and sticks to mark where each crop would go. The same pattern as last year, with small adjustments based on what had lasted through the winter. The seeds had been counted, sorted, tucked into pouches of wool and bark. You and your sister helped arrange them by planting thyme, touching each one with care as if their shapes held stories. Your uncle watched from his seat, offering suggestions now and then, remembering where the carrots had grown best, which corner got too much sun in the later months. Even the children were invited to place the markers, to learn the shape of the garden they would care for. That night, dinner was louder than usual. The warmth had stirred something in everyone, and voices rose with stories and questions, with laughter and memory. Your father recounted the first time he tried to build a scarecrow, and how the crows had used its shoulders as a perch. Your cousin described the dream he'd had the night before, of a field where the wheat grew tall enough to touch the stars. Your aunt corrected him gently, reminding him that wheat didn't grow that high, and he grinned as if that was the whole point. The stew pot was scraped clean, and even the crusts were shared until nothing remained but the sound of full bellies and soft breath. When the fire dimmed and the longhouse settled into rest, you lay with your arms folded beneath your head, staring at the rafters. The bird Frey had carved was still beside you, its grainy shape now smooth from your palm's touch. The air felt easier to breathe tonight, not because it was warmer, but because you were no longer waiting. Winter had not vanished, but it had begun to release its hold, and in its place came something gentler, more forgiving. Tomorrow you would return to the field, check the seed bundles, maybe even mark the garden rows with string. Small steps, but steps forward. You closed your eyes and let the sounds of your family carry you. A cough, a murmur, the rustle of someone turning in their sleep. You breathed in deeply, then let it go. And in that breath was the promise of all that still lay ahead. The sound of dripping became a steady presence, threading itself into the rhythm of each day like a quiet percussion. It fell from the eaves in slow beads, landed on packed snow with soft pops, and ran in little rivulets through grooves worn by boots and buckets. You no longer woke to silence, but to the soft insistence of meltwater weaving its way through the world. The snow was shrinking, not dramatic, ally, but steadily. In places, it had pulled back from the edges of the fence, revealing tufts of brittle grass pressed flat against the earth. In others, it pooled and darkened into slush, the last stubborn ice giving way to sun and time. And though the wind still carried a bite, it no longer scolded, it whispered instead, as if it knew its time was nearly done. Inside the longhouse, the air held a different weight. Less smoke, more movement. The hearth still burned, but with less urgency. Blankets were folded rather than worn. The children lingered by the door now, eager to be outside, and even the adults had started speaking more often of plans and planting, of trade routes opening, of letters and messages to be sent to distant kin once the fjord cleared. Your father had carved a new handle for the spade and oiled it with bear fat, then left it leaning against the doorway like a totem. Your mother had begun to sing again in the mornings, not lullabies, but songs meant for waking, songs that stirred the limbs and lifted the spirit before the day began. You caught yourself humming the tune later as you worked the edge of the garden plot, your hands sunk into cold but willing soil, your breath coming in even bursts. Frey had taken to helping you more in the field now, not because he had to, but because it felt right. The two of you moved well together, clearing the larger rocks that had risen through the ground's freeze-thaw churn, smoothing the rows with flat boards, marking spaces for peas and early greens. There was little talk, but no silence either. Only the sound of tools against soil, of boots shifting in thawed dirt, of shared work building towards something whole. At one point, he paused, wiped the sweat from his brow despite the chill, and pointed to the ridge where the deer path had begun to emerge. You both stood watching for a long while, half expecting a creature to appear, and though none did, the possibility itself was a kind of gift. Your sister had begun tending to the hens again, coaxing them from the corner where they'd spent most of the winter, scattering feed and dried moss, whispering to them like they were old friends returning from a long sleep. One afternoon, she found the first egg, a small misshapen thing still warm from the hen's belly. She brought it in cupped in both hands like it might break from breath alone, and the whole house paused to marvel at it. Your uncle laughed for the first time in weeks, a hoarse, crackling sound that made your aunt's eyes fill with tears. Your mother boiled the egg gently and cut it into 6 careful pieces, one for each of the younger children. They ate it like a sacrament, their lips closed around each bite, their eyes wide with reverence. You spent more time outside each day, your body adjusting again to the feel of wind and sun, your muscles remembering the demands of the season. One morning you rose before the others and walked to the edge of the property alone, the frost still clinging to the edges of branches and the early light brushing the tops of the trees. You stood for a while watching the light shift, watching your breath curl in the air, listening to the bird song that had begun to return in hesitant threads. It was not loud yet, not like the full chorus of summer, but it was present. A single bird calling, then another, and then the silence between them filled with meaning. You let the sounds settle in your bones before turning back. Your aunt had taken out her loom, small and portable, and set it near the hearth where the light was strongest. She worked slowly, her hands still recovering from long days of care and cold, but the threads moved smoothly, the pattern emerging in reds and browns like the colors of the earth outside. She said she would make a shawl for your uncle, something new to wrap around him when he sat out in the sun again. He had taken to sitting by the door each day now, wrapped in fur, his legs covered, his hands resting on his knees. He did not speak often, but his eyes followed everything, the movement of the children, the repairs to the fence, the washing hung to dry on sun-warmed poles. He watched as if memorizing, as if anchoring himself to the world again through its smallest details. Evenings grew softer. Meals were heartier now with the addition of wild greens, of nettles boiled and mashed with salt and fat, of thin strips of dried meat rehydrated in onion broth. One night your father produced a small pouch of dried apples, a surprise saved from before the winter, and your mother baked them into a flat cake that made the entire house smell like memory. You all sat close that evening, hands brushing as bowls were passed, shoulders touching, the fire reflecting in eyes that had known cold and now craved only this, the warmth of presence, the simple gift of another meal shared. That night, as you prepared for sleep, your sister placed the carved bird you had kept all winter on the shelf above the fire. It had traveled in your pocket, in your palm, beside your bed. Now it belonged to the house again, no longer a talisman of endurance, but a symbol of return. You watched as the firelight played across its surface, casting its shadow upward like a wing stretching into flight. The longhouse was quiet, not with the hush of dread, but with the peace of rest. Breathing was slow and even, interrupted only by the soft creak of the roof beams settling. Lying beneath your blanket, you thought of the garden, of the way your hands had felt pressing seeds into the soil, of how your sister's face had lit up when the hens clucked back to her, of how your mother's humming had followed you into the field without ever leaving the hearth. These were not grand things, not the stuff of saga or song, but they were yours. They were real. They were enough. You closed your eyes with the scent of the baked apples still clinging to the air and the faint sounds of spring outside the door. And as you drifted towards sleep, it was not the memory of hardship that followed you, but the softness that came after, the slow unfurling of something tender and true. In that stillness you felt the story settle deeper into your bones, not a tale of survival, but of belonging, of bonds formed not in triumph, but in togetherness. And that story you knew would carry you through every season yet to come. By the time the first week of full thaw had passed, you could feel the earth itself breathing again beneath your boots. It wasn't just that the snow had lessened, though that was part of it. It was the way the wind no longer came with teeth, how it brushed against your cheek and carried the scent of wet bark, of rot turning to soil, of living things stirring where they'd been curled in seize, islands. Puddles spread wide across the yard, reflecting pieces of sky, and every so often you'd see something shimmer beneath them, a pebble, a scrap of straw, the edge of a buried tool forgotten during the hardest days of snow. Your fingers itched to touch soil now, not because of hunger or fear, but because you wanted to be part of its waking, to greet it like a friend you hadn't spoken to in too long. Each morning the family stepped outside a little earlier, stayed out a little longer. Boots grew muddier, laughter less guarded. The work had resumed, yes, but without the desperation that had clung to it before. Now it felt like a slow unfolding. The longhouse no longer pressed inwards with every breath. Instead, it held space, as if its walls had opened themselves slightly to let the season in. Inside, tasks had shifted. The heavier woolen cloaks had been folded and stored at the back of the room. Furs were shaken and hung to air near the entrance. Your mother began boiling fewer herbs, storing them instead in tightly wrapped pouches, tucking them behind jars and under the floor where the shadows kept things cool. The smell of vinegar and smoke was joined now by the sharper scent of sun-dried onion skin, the bright, bitter notes of early roots boiled for dye. Your uncle had regained enough strength to stand unaided, and he took each step like a man returning from some far shore. His legs were shaky, but his resolve was steady, and the way your aunt watched him was a quiet testament to everything that had been held together during his long silence. He spent hours now outside by the tool rack, repairing handles and bindings, testing the weight of each axe and mallet, whistling low songs that only the wind could hear. When you joined him there one afternoon, he handed you a chisel and pointed toward a cracked yoke. The two of you worked without a word, side by side in the slanted light, your hands echoing each other's motion as though drawn by the same memory. You looked up once to find him watching you, his face unreadable but full, and you understood something passed between you in that gaze. Not approval exactly, but recognition. You had both lived through something, and now you were part of the shape it had left behind. The days continued like this, measured, filled with motion, but not urgency. The children ventured farther toward the tree line now, searching for the early signs of green among the moss. Your sister returned one evening with a handful of wild garlic, her fingers stained and her smile bright with discovery. That night, the broth tasted different, lighter, like a door left open to let spring wander in. Frey brought down a woven trap he'd built for the river and tested it with a stone weight in the stream that had begun trickling again just east of the house. He worked quietly, always with that carved patience of his, but now when he looked up from his tasks, there was a softness in his eyes you hadn't seen before the long cold. A kind of openness, as though whatever armor he'd once worn had cracked somewhere and let something human come through. One late afternoon, your father gathered everyone outside and spoke. He of the neighboring farmstead that had been silent since Yule. It wasn't far, just over the ridge, but the snows had cut it off entirely for months. There had been no word, no trade, no sign of life. He said it was time to go see, to bring what food you could spare, and check if help was needed. You volunteered without hesitation. So did Frey, and your sister asked to come too, though she would stay back with the younger cousins instead. Your mother handed you 2 cloth bundles, one of dried meat, the other of rye flatbread wrapped in birch bark, and kissed your forehead in a way she hadn't since before the solstice. You left at first light, your feet crunching across the frost-touched path. The sky above pale and high, the trees creaking softly in the morning wind. The walk was longer than it had once felt, perhaps because you hadn't gone so far in so many weeks. Your legs burned a little with the climb, but the motion felt good, the pull of muscles long unused, waking something inside you. As you crested the ridge, the view opened wide, a patchwork of brown fields, tree stumps half submerged in meltwater, a few smoke trails curling from distant homes. When you reached the neighboring farm, you paused, uncertain. The door was closed, but there were fresh tracks in the mud, and the fence had been repaired recently. You knocked, and the sound felt loud after so much quiet. After a moment, it opened. There stood a woman you remembered from the last harvest, her face thinner now, eyes wary, but she smiled when she recognized you. Behind her, 2 children peeked out. They were smaller than you recalled, but alive, cheeks smudged with soot and hands wrapped in mismatched cloth. You spent only an hour there, exchanging food, stories, promises to return. They had lost 1 elder, she said, and a goat to sickness, but they had survived, just as you had. As you walked back down the ridge, the light changed again, bright and gold, like the last hour before evening when everything softens. You turned to Frey and found him already looking at you. He didn't speak, but you nodded, and he nodded back, and the silence between you was full of meaning. That night, your father lit a larger fire than usual and sat by it with a small cup of honeyed ale, saved for such a moment. You all gathered close, knees touching, backs leaning against each other. He told the story of a spring long ago when the ice broke too early and the boats went out too soon, and how a trader had returned with pepper root, and stories of lands where winter never touched the sea. Your uncle added details, his voice steady again, and your aunt laughed when he exaggerated. Even the youngest children sat still, drawn into the rhythm of voice and flame, their eyes wide in the flicker of firelight. Later, as sleep settled over the longhouse, you lay on your back and listened to the sounds that had become familiar again. Breathing, wind against wood, the soft click of cooling stones. But underneath it all was something else now. A readiness, a beginning. You closed your eyes and felt it rise within you. The quiet strength that came not from having endured, but from knowing you'd never done it alone. By the time another week had passed, the land around your home no longer looked like a memory held in ice. It had changed quietly, without any grand announcement, in the subtle ways that only those who'd watched every inch through the leanest nights could truly notice. The patches of exposed ground no longer held just melted snow, but tiny threads of green, fragile and persistent, weaving upward toward a sky that stayed lighter each day. Pools of water shimmered between roots and stones, carrying leaves and twigs like boats adrift. The air smelled clearer, less like wood smoke and ash, and more like pine needles, thawed bark, and distant mud. Even the crows flew lower now, searching along the fields instead of circling above in search of carrion. The world slowly and patiently was opening its hands again. Life inside the longhouse matched that unfolding. Tasks had taken on rhythm, no longer interrupted by uncertainty or sickness. The routine that had once been built out of necessity now began to hum with purpose. Your mother's fingers worked with thread and needle once more, not repairing torn cloaks but stitching new ones from stored wool, bright with trim and made for ceremony as much as function. Your sister had taken to scrubbing the floorboards on her knees with sand and snowmelt, claiming it helped her think, though you knew it was a way to make space for something more than survival. Even your younger cousins, who had once hovered near the hearth as if distance were danger, now ventured into every corner, building forts out of stacked logs and chasing each other with shouts that made the chickens scatter. You woke most mornings just before first light, not from dread or duty, but because something inside you wanted to meet the day. Frey would sometimes already be outside, his breath curling in the air, a rake or hammer in his hands, moving through the mist like someone stepping into himself again. You joined him without words. The two of you had become a team, not through blood, but through the quiet stitching of days shared and trust earned without being named. Together, you repaired the roof where the snow had caused a sag in the far corner. It was slow work, awkward and cold, but there was laughter too, the kind that came not from jokes, but from the clumsy grace of dropped nails and bark slipping underfoot. You caught Frey grinning at one point as a loose board knocked your cap into the mud, and you couldn't help but laugh back, your voice rising freely into the soft morning. One evening your uncle asked to be taken to the fjord. He said he needed to see it with his own eyes to know it was still there, that the ice was receding as it always had. So you and your father fashioned a small cart, padded it with blankets, and together pulled him down the long slope to where the frozen expanse met the shore. The path had thawed in places, and in others you had to hack at stubborn chunks of ice. But when you reached the water's edge, the sight silenced all of you. The ice had begun to fracture, long jagged seams splitting its surface, shining with water and sun. At its edges, clear water lapped against rock, gentle and alive. Your uncle sat quietly for a long while, his breath shallow but steady. Then, in a voice that barely rose above the wind, he said, "It kept its promise." No one needed to ask what he meant. You felt it too. The fjord had waited, just like you had. And now it welcomed you back. That night, your aunt cooked with something new. A handful of dried herbs he'd hidden away, mixed into stew, with boiled barley and wild garlic. It was the kind of flavor that made everyone pause after the first bite, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was almost forgotten. You all ate slowly, savoring it, letting the taste draw out memories of other springs, of feast days and family visits, of years when the world had felt bigger and kinder. Your cousin asked about the first time the village had gathered after a hard winter, and your father told of a celebration held during his boyhood when a travelling skald had come with a harp carved from whalebone and sung through the night by torchlight. Your mother laughed softly and added that someone had fallen asleep in the soup that evening, and your uncle grinned and pointed at your father, who only shrugged and said, "It was warm, wasn't it?" The stories kept coming long after the fire had gone low. And when the younger ones finally drifted to sleep curled in bundles by the wall, the grown ones stayed a little longer, voices soft, leaning into memory like it was a blanket shared. You listened as your father spoke of the old paths through the mountains, of fishing villages along the western coast where the salt clung to your skin for days, of markets where everything could be traded, even stories. Your aunt told of her mother's first spring alone, how she had planted every seed with her eyes closed and claimed it was her way of letting the gods decide the harvest. Frey shared that he once believed he would travel as a shipbuilder, following his uncle across the islands until the illness kept him here. And then he looked at you, not with regret, but with a steadiness that told you he no longer saw his path as a lesser one. As sleep finally pulled at your limbs, you lay wrapped in warmth that was not only from the furs but from something deeper, and knowing that the house no longer held just survivors but people living again. The snow outside would continue to melt. The earth would soon open wide for planting, the fjord would welcome boats, and trade would return, and with it all the colours and voices of a world that had once seemed impossibly distant. But even if those things took longer than expected, you knew this. Your family had found a way to hold itself together, not just through strength, but through grace. Through laughter shared over ashes, through kindness passed without fanfare, through each quiet act that said, "I see you, I need you, we are still here." You closed your eyes and let the story of this winter slip into your bones, not to be forgotten, but to be carried like a stone in your pocket, smooth and worn, something to touch when the days ahead grew long again. In that final moment before sleep, you heard the faint creak of the rafters, the whisper of someone turning in their bed, the far-off drip of meltwater finding its way home, and you breathed in, slow and deep, knowing you were part of something larger than the cold had ever been. The thaw no longer whispered at the edges of your world. It had fully arrived, though it still wore the heavy coat of early spring. Mornings began with a chorus of water, the steady rhythm of drip and trickle and splash as the last of the snow surrendered its weight. The mud clung to everything now, boots and skirts and the hems of cloaks, and it carried the sharp scent of old roots and thawing moss. But no one complained. After the silent white of winter, even mud felt like abundance. The fields beyond the longhouse lay dark and sodden, waiting. The birches stood with their thin limbs budding in soft green, the promise of leaves coiled inside, like breath before speech. When you looked across the landscape now, you didn't see stillness. You saw potential, you saw the hush, before something new began. Your father had begun venturing farther each morning, mapping out the fences that needed rebuilding, the paths that had been lost beneath snowdrifts, the patches of brush that had grown wild during the months of neglect. You sometimes went with him, walking in companionable silence, each of you sinking knee-deep in meltwater at times, laughing when you lost your footing. Once, you found the old marker stones that lined the border to your kin's grazing land, half buried but still upright, their carved runes softened by time and weather. He traced one with his fingers and murmured something under his breath, too quiet to catch. You didn't ask. It felt like a conversation between him and the land, something older than either of you. Inside the longhouse, preparation had become ritual. Your mother moved with a kind of grace now, setting pots to boil, grinding grains with the steadiness of someone who knew exactly how much she could stretch and how far. She had begun preparing offerings, little bundles of herbs and dried berries tied in cloth, meant for the spring blessing. Your aunt helped, sitting across from her at the table with her back straight, her hands nimble, as she sorted the last of the elderflowers and marigold petals into careful piles. The scent rose between them like memory, sweet and a little bitter. They did not speak often, but when they did, it was in quiet tones that carried no urgency, only understanding. The children had begun practicing the songs again, their voices high and unsure at first, then bolder as the tunes came back. You recognized them all, the planting songs, the welcome back chants, the call and response games meant to wake the fields and thank the soil. Even your sister joined in, humming softly as she gathered rushes for weaving, her eyes thoughtful, her hands stained with early shoots and dye. There was something different in her now, not just the pride of having survived, but the beginning of a voice that wasn't borrowed from others. She had found something this winter, and though she hadn't said it aloud, you could see it in the way she moved through the house, like someone who knew they belonged. When the first gathering was announced, a quiet ritual of spring renewal at the village hall, you felt a ripple move through everyone. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it. No one had gathered like that since before the deep snow, and the idea of being in a room full of voices again felt both thrilling and strange. The morning of the blessing came with a soft sky and damp air, the kind that clung to your cloak and made your hair curl against your cheeks. You dressed carefully, layering your tunic with a cleaned sash, pinning your woolen wrap at the shoulder with the family brooch. Your sister helped you smooth it, her hands gentle, her face serious in the candlelight. The entire household moved more slowly than usual, not from laziness, but from reverence. Every gesture that morning seemed to hold weight, like each person was carrying not just themselves, but all that had happened in the silent months behind them. The walk to the hall was slippery in places, the path carved into the hillside by generations, but now edged with thawed debris and pooling water. You passed other families on the way, people you hadn't seen in weeks or months. Some waved, others nodded with cautious smiles. There was no need for long greetings. Everyone was holding something sacred inside, and to speak too freely felt like poking a hole in it. You arrived just as the sky began to shift, that strange, soft blue that always comes before rain or revelation. The hall stood open, its great wooden doors propped wide. Smoke curled from its chimney, and inside, warmth waited. Stepping into the space was like returning to a part of yourself you had folded away. The smell of peat and pine, the shimmer of polished stone on the floor, the rows of benches worn smooth by years of bodies pressing into them. Faces turned as you entered, some familiar, others changed by winter's long hand. There were fewer people than the year before. You noticed the empty spaces without needing to count them, but you also noticed the ones who had returned, standing taller, eyes brighter, bodies thinner perhaps, but full of presence. A murmur moved through the room, not words exactly, more like the sound of something waking. The blessing was simple, as it had always been. A bowl of water drawn from the stream, warmed with sunstones, passed from hand to hand. A branch of green dipped and shaken over the threshold. Words spoken in rhythm by the elders, half prayer, half invocation, calling on the land to receive the seeds and the hands that would plant them. No great sermon, no elaborate ritual, just voices rising together, joined in shared breath and memory. You stood among them, your feet planted on the stones, and felt something loosen inside, a knot you hadn't realized you'd tied during the worst nights. It didn't come undone with drama, it just slipped free, leaving space for something else to settle in its place. Afterward, there was food passed around, modest but lovingly made. Flat cakes with herbs, small strips of smoked fish, a jar of fermented root spread. Children played outside, their boots leaving deep prints in the softened earth. Elders shared stories in small circles, voices low but steady. You found Frey near the doorway, his arms crossed, watching the gathering with a look you couldn't quite name. When he caught your eye, he smiled, not wide, just enough. And in that moment it felt like the story you had lived through together was still unfolding, even here among others. Walking back home took longer than you remembered, not because of the path, but because everyone walked more slowly. There was no rush. Spring would not be hurried. The world had turned on its own time, and you were learning to match its pace again. As the longhouse came into view, warm smoke rising from its chimney, chickens pecking at the thawing yard, you felt your shoulders relax for the first time in what felt like months. The home was no longer a refuge against the cold. It was simply home again. That night, sleep came easily. Not as an escape, but as a return. The furs felt softer, the air smelled of pine and rain. And as your eyes closed, you saw not the shadows of winter, but the outlines of all that would grow in the light. The days that followed the blessing moved in a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly tender, like slipping into an old song whose lyrics had gained new weight. Spring did not rush in. It arrived in hesitations, in the small gestures of green where there had been only grey. In the cautious way the sun lingered longer at the edge of the sky before dipping below the hills. But for those who had watched the cold seep through the seams of their lives and had weathered it together, every returning bird, every sprouting blade, felt like a quiet promise being kept. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. You found yourself rising before the others more often now, not from obligation, but from a need to meet the light when it first touched the grass. The fields behind the longhouse had lost their sheen of meltwater and stood ready, the earth soft and dark beneath your feet. Your boots sank slightly as you walked the rows, the soles catching in pockets of rich mud. There was a heaviness in the soil, but it was a living weight. It gave back when pressed. It received your steps with patience, as though it remembered you from before the frost and had been waiting for your return. Your father had divided the planting into slow, careful days. There was no need to race now. The cold snap had passed, and the sky no longer carried the threat of sudden snow. You worked side by side with your sister, each of you moving in tandem, fingers black with dirt and arms streaked with sweat by midday. The sun warmed your back, and occasionally a wind would sweep across the clearing and carry the scent of pine and damp bark, reminding you of the woods beyond. Frey joined you when he could, hauling water from the stream in buckets, helping to mark rows with twine pulled taut between sticks, his quiet presence a steady heartbeat beneath the day's motion. In the evenings the house smelled of onion broth and smoke, of newly boiled nettle greens and the faint sweetness of roasted root vegetables. It was a softer scent than the heavy stews of winter, brighter somehow, like the meals were beginning to mirror the air outside. You sat around the hearth with your family, hands still stained, backs sore, but hearts lighter. There was talk now not only of what had passed, but of what was coming. Your uncle began carving again, his hands surer with the knife, his expression more open as he shaped a small wooden fox for one of the children. Your aunt sang softly while spinning, LD songs braided with new verses of her own invention. The fire crackled like it was listening. On one afternoon, a neighbor came down the path with her eldest son, carrying a basket of dried fish and early dandelion greens as a trade for wool scraps and flax. She stayed for tea, sitting beside your mother and sharing the quiet grief of a cousin lost during the storms. It was not a loud conversation nor weeping, but a gentle laying down of memory between women who understood each other. They drank slowly, and when the basket was exchanged, it felt like more than goods passing hands. It felt like something binding, a thread re-knotted after being stretched thin by months of silence. The planting continued through the week, expanding from rye and barley into peas and turnips, each seed pressed with intention into the soil. Your father reminded you to speak to them, not in full sentences, but in tone, in breath, in small hums of welcome. The old ways still lived in him, not as superstition but as habit, as a belief that the land heard more than just footsteps. You found yourself humming as you worked, not always aware of it, but comforted by the sound when you noticed. It became a kind of music, this mix of labor and voice, a melody that only the soil and sky could understand. One evening, after the fields were watered and the sun sat low behind the tree line, your sister asked to walk with you to the edge of the woods. The path was narrow and slick with moss, the trees still bare in places, their branches clawing gently at the sky. You moved slowly, speaking little, but as you reached the clearing where the wild strawberries used to grow, She stopped and turned to you. She said the winter had made her feel small, not just in body, but in spirit, like she had shrunk to fit the fear. But now, standing there with the soft ground beneath her and the sky breathing overhead, she felt something returning, not all at once, but piece by piece. You nodded. You knew the feeling. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, this healing. It was as slow and quiet as frost melting from a branch. Back at the longhouse, Frey had lit the fire and was carving by the hearth, a new project forming between his hands. You joined him without words, sitting close enough to feel the heat on your skin. The others drifted in one by one until the room was filled again, not with noise but with presence. The kind of quiet that speaks of peace. Someone asked for a story, and your mother began, her voice low and rhythmic, telling of a girl who befriended a spirit in the forest and learned the language of trees. The children listened with wide eyes, their breath catching in unison at every twist. Even the adults leaned in, not for the tale itself, but for the way it gathered them. As the fire dimmed and the shadows stretched, you lay down near the doorway, your head on your rolled cloak, the scent of damp wood and old straw in your nose. You listened to the wind rustling through the cracks above, to the slow exhale of a sleeping room. And as your eyes began to close, you thought not of hardship, but of the hands that had met yours in the soil, of the voices that had risen together in blessing, of the warmth that came from simply being held in place by the people around you. The longhouse, once a fortress against cold, had become something gentler. It was a nest now, a space where the outside world could come in and be softened, where memory and hope sat side by side without jostling for space. The winter had taken much, but it had also shaped something that spring could now fill. And in that space between breath and sleep, you knew this was not the end of the story, it was the heart of it. The days had softened into a kind of quiet rhythm, each one folding gently into the next. There was no rush in the air, no pressing urgency like before. The land no longer groaned under snow, but settled into the calm murmur of thaw and growth. Your feet had learned to walk differently now, lighter, more attuned to the softness of soil beneath the moss, to the give of a field no longer frozen. You could feel the difference in your bones, how your body no longer braced against the cold, how your shoulders relaxed without you having to remind them. Even your breath, when drawn in early morning light, held warmth now. It was a kind of exhale that had waited all winter. The longhouse, once wrapped tightly against the elements, had opened its doors more often. The wood still creaked, still carried the smell of old smoke and dried herbs, but now it felt alive in a new way. Sunlight angled in differently, reaching farther into corners that had stayed in shadow for months. It painted the floor in golden strips where children played again, their voices softer but somehow more grounded, more certain of the space they filled. The hearth still burned each evening, but more as habit than necessity. It had become a center again, not a shield. Your mornings were spent in the garden plot, coaxing reluctant shoots from the earth, your hands working in tandem with Frey's. There was ease now in your companionship, not built of silence but of understanding, of days piled one atop another, where you had learned the same weather, felt the same walls press close, shared the same long exhale of spring. You spoke more often now, not always of meaningful things, but of stories you had heard as children, of meals you wished you could taste again, of the feel of the ocean beneath your feet, though neither of you had seen the sea in seasons. There were pauses between your words, but they no longer he LD strain. They were soft spaces, places for breath and thought to stretch out and be. One evening, as you washed your hands at the basin near the door, your mother leaned beside you and said simply, "You're taller." You laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true and strange to realize it all at once. She touched your shoulder briefly, not to measure, but to feel. You caught something in her eyes then, not surprise, but reflection. She had watched you change, had noted the widening of your voice, the deepening of your movements. Not all growth is measured by height, and both of you knew it. The village paths had filled again with footsteps. Neighbors passed with baskets and sleds, turned wheelbarrows, children carried sacks of kindling to trade for honey or salt. Someone had carved a new totem pole near the edge of the commons, its surface still raw and pale, the runes fresh and unweathered. You walked past it on your way to deliver dried herbs to the widow whose garden had not survived the frost, and you traced the marks with your fingers, feeling their grooves like a memory half-formed. When she opened the door, she gave you a smile without teeth, but filled with light. She invited you in, poured warm mead from a tiny clay jug, and told you about the time she had danced through the rain barefoot because her mother had dared her to. You listened, not because it was expected, but because her voice was the kind that turned stories into shelter. Back home, the evenings were longer now. You found yourself lingering outside after supper, watching the sky shift into shades of blue and lavender. The light held longer at the horizon, and the stars came slowly, one by one, like old friends approaching from far away. Your sister joined you sometimes, resting her head on your shoulder without needing a reason. You didn't always speak. You didn't need to. The silence between you had grown rich, filled with shared work, old arguments softened by time, and laughter that belonged only to the two of you. Your uncle had taken to walking each morning, short loops around the perimeter of the homestead, his cane tapping the earth like a second heartbeat. He greeted the chickens as if they were comrades, squatted to inspect the early onions, leaned against the side of the barn to catch his breath and look up at the clouds. He told your aunt, not loudly, that he thought he would live to see another harvest. She nodded, and though her smile barely moved, it was full. That evening she baked flat cakes with dried apple slivers folded into them and served them warm, wrapped in linen, with nothing said about why. One day the children built a fort of sticks and moss beneath the birch trees. They called it a trading hall and invented stories about sea voyages and merchants from beyond the mountains. They bartered pine cones for carved buttons, wildflowers for smooth stones, and at one point your youngest cousin stood on a stump and declared himself the king of spring. No one corrected him. The grown-ups watched from a distance, pretending not to smile. Your father leaned against the fence and said softly, "Let them pretend they've earned it." And you knew what he meant. Pretending wasn't just escape. It was practice. It was how you tested the shape of joy after a season of scarcity. It was how you remembered what it felt like to make something from nothing. And wasn't that what all of you had done in your own way? That night, as the fire dimmed and the room settled into sleep, you lay beneath your blanket and listened to the house breathe. It was no longer the sound of endurance, but of presence. The walls creaked because they were warm. The furs shifted because they were shared. Somewhere near the hearth, someone stirred in sleep and muttered a dream aloud, half lost before it ever reached waking. and outside the wind moved through the trees, not with warning, but with welcome. You,
Your eyes closed slowly, not out of weariness, but with the comfort of belonging. The winter was behind you, the planting had begun, and the world, wide and familiar and strange all at once, was waiting for you again. The wind that moved through the trees now came not as warning, not with the edge of snow behind it, but as a quiet visitor brushing through the branches with the gentleness of spring. It carried the smell of soil and bark and something sweeter still, like sap warmed by daylight or blossoms just thinking of waking. The forest had begun its slow unfurling, not all at once, but in the scattered rhythm of a season that knew the weight of patience. You could see it in the way moss brightened at the base of the birches, in the way sunlight pooled longer on the stone path before fading, in the way the birds' songs no longer sounded like solitary calls across silence, but like part of something shared. The world had opened again, and you were still here to witness it. Inside the longhouse, the days moved with a soft steadiness. Routines had returned, but they no longer felt like a defense. They were offerings now. Acts of rebuilding not from rubble, but from soil. Your mother sang as she kneaded bread, her voice low and steady, like it had been before the frost set in. Your sister hung rush mats to dry in the afternoon sun, pausing sometimes to watch the light catch on dust motes dancing in the air. Your uncle sat outside with his cloak pulled tight around him, carving not for utility now but for beauty, shaping little figurines of deer and boats and sleeping wolves to give to the children. Your father had taken to walking farther each day, not because there was something to find, but because there was space now to wander without bracing. He came home with his boots damp and his voice calm, stories in his pocket, and a quiet in his eyes that felt like spring itself. One morning you helped your aunt wash the winter blankets for storage. The water was still cold in the stream, but you didn't mind. Your hands moved with hers, dipping and wringing, laying the cloth over wide branches to dry in the sun. She told you about the winter after her first child was born, how she had been afraid of the dark then, not because of the cold, but because of the silence. She said it had taken her months to learn that silence could also mean rest, that it wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was the space in which things grew. You nodded, not because you understood entirely, but because you wanted to carry that thought with you. The planting had gone well. The rows behind the longhouse sat neat and dark, speckled with green. The smell of earth lingered on your clothes, under your nails, in your hair. It felt like something to be proud of, though no one said it aloud. The pride lived in the way your father passed you the seed pouch without instruction now, in the way your mother accepted your help without explanation. Even the chickens, fatter now, pecked with a kind of confident rhythm as if the land itself had eased. The first of the gatherings was set for the equinox, a festival not just of balance, but of thanks. Your village didn't mark such days with grandeur, not after a winter like the last, but there would be music and simple food and firelight shared without fear of running low. Preparations began slowly. Your sister braided strands of red yarn into the hair of the younger cousins. Frey helped raise a low platform near the riverbank for songs and stories. You carved a row of runes into a new bench for the village square, your hands steady even when the wood splintered beneath the blade. The evening before the gathering, your family sat together beneath the open sky. No one said it, but you knew why. It was the same spot you had all stood,
During the last snowfall, your bodies huddled close as the world seemed to hold its breath. Now the air was warm enough to sit without cloaks, and the stars blinked above without being swallowed by cloud. Your father poured a small cup of ale and passed it around, each person taking a sip. No toast, no words, just the sound of night and the feeling of being here, still together. When morning came, the sky was clear. You dressed in your simplest tunic, but tied a strip of blue cloth around your arm, a sign of renewal. At the village square, people gathered slowly, their footsteps light on the soft earth. Someone played a harp near the center post. Children ran between legs and arms and old friends, chasing one another with laughter that had been quiet for too long. Food passed from hand to hand, baskets filled with dried fruit, slices of barley bread, bits of cured fish and early herbs. You stood beside Frey, near the edge of the crowd, watching, listening. He leaned toward you slightly and said, "We made it." Just those 3 words, but they sat in your chest like a second heartbeat. The stories began at dusk. Elders spoke first, their voices rasped by time, but full of memory. Then younger ones followed, telling tales of dreams and hunts and small moments turned sacred by hardship. Your sister stepped forward at one point, holding a single woven doll. She told a story about the wind and how it once stole her voice and then returned it wrapped in frost and kindness. You recognized the shape of the truth inside it. And when she finished, the quiet that followed was not hesitation, it was reverence. That night, as the fire burned low and families began to drift home, your own returned slowly to the longhouse. No one hurried. The stars wheeled above you. The path was familiar now, each stone and bend like a friend. You crossed the threshold together, and the door closed behind you, not with the sound of sealing out the world, but with the comfort of belonging to it. Later, lying beneath your blanket, listening to the breathing of those you loved, you felt the fullness of the story in your bones. Not just this winter, but all the winters that had come before, all the ones that would come again. You had not simply survived, you had been shaped. And the people around you, once just parts of your day, had become the rhythm of your life. As sleep came, it did not feel like escape. It felt like return, like sinking into the arms of something older than fear. The land had turned, the family had held, and within you there was peace.